Why life was brutal in ancient Egypt. Boring history for sleep. Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the sands of time. As the celestial bodies rotate overhead and the night grows increasingly silent, I invite you to rest your weary head and allow your imagination to wander to a land of endless sand and imposing stone, of mighty flowing rivers and towering pyramids that pierce the sky. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization of wonder and mystery, but also one of immense hardship and constant struggle. As you drift toward slumber, perhaps nestled in a comfortable bed or stretched out on a plush couch, take a moment to reflect. What region of the world do you call home? What hour has the clock struck where you now rest your head? Whether it's the mysterious midnight hour or the first gentle light of dawn, I extend my warmest welcome to you. If you've enjoyed this content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Of course, only if you find genuine value in what's shared here. If you find pleasure in historical voyages, tales narrated in calming tones as you transition into dreams, I encourage you to subscribe. Many more historical narratives await. But tonight, our attention turns to the trials and tribulations of existence in ancient Egypt. It's an era that occupies a significant place in our collective imagination. Towering monuments, kings adorned with golden masks, and the enigmatic secrets of mummification have long captivated our interest. Popular media often portrays a romanticized image of this distant age, with pyramids gleaming brilliantly under the scorching sun, and nobility draped in the finest linen and adorned with glittering jewels as they navigate the waters of the Nile. And while Egypt's achievements were indeed remarkable, the precision and scale of the Great Pyramids, the sublime artistry of their temples and tombs, the sophistication of their writing systems, and astronomical knowledge, we must remember that these extraordinary marvels were constructed through the back-breaking labor of countless individuals. For every pharaoh lounging in opulent palaces, thousands upon thousands of Egyptians toiled relentlessly in fields, labored in workshops, and fought in brutal wars. Their lives were frequently difficult, dangerous, and tragically short. In the unforgiving environment of the Nile River Valley, existence hung in a precarious balance. The annual floods that irrigated their crops could just as easily devastate entire villages and plant the seeds of widespread famine. The same blazing sun that baked the bricks of majestic monuments also mercilessly scorched the laborers, who stacked them ever higher toward the sky. From the lowest servant to the most respected scribe, life in ancient Egypt was filled with adversity. So join me as we part the curtains of romance and nostalgia to glimpse the harsh realities faced by the men and women who built and sustained this dazzling civilization through their daily struggles. We'll explore 6 fundamental aspects of Egyptian life that made it a constant battle for survival. The oppressive social hierarchy that determined one's fate from birth. The relentless grind of forced labor that built the monuments we still marvel at. Today, the devastating ravages of war that repeatedly swept through the kingdom, the numerous dangers lurking within their own homes, the ever-present specter of sickness and injury in a pre-modern medical world, and the constant sting of grief as they buried their loved ones, often far too young. Along this journey, we'll focus on individual lives and personal stories, putting human faces to the grand sweep of history. We'll witness mighty pharaohs, confronting crises that threatened the very foundations of their authority, but also humble craftsmen and farmers striving desperately to provide for their families against overwhelming odds, and though we'll encounter suffering and injustice throughout our narrative, we'll also marvel at the remarkable resilience of the Egyptian spirit, a spirit that endured for 3 millennia against all adversities. So, make yourself comfortable, dear listener, and let the worries of your day gradually fade away. The Nile is beginning its rise. The sun is climbing steadily over the distant cliffs, and there's important work to be done, for life, in all its beauty and brutality, stops for no one in this realm of shifting sands and timeless wonders. Let us begin our journey with the very element that made Egypt's triumphs and tragedies possible, the river that has always been its lifeblood and at times its greatest peril. The mighty Nile has long been called Egypt's greatest blessing, the source of the fertile black soil and abundant water that allowed a sophisticated civilization to flourish in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving desert landscape. But living at the mercy of the river's unpredictable cycles could be a truly harrowing experience. Each summer, the Nile would surge dramatically over its banks, swollen with monsoon rains and melting snow from distant mountains far beyond Egypt's borders. The floodwaters would drown the surrounding fields and pastures, washing away boundary stones and familiar landmarks. Farmers watched nervously as the murky tide lapped at the threshold of their simple mud brick houses, praying fervently to the god Hapi to halt the deluge before it could sweep away their homes and livelihoods. But they desperately needed that flood, for it carried tons of Ethiopian silt to replenish their fields for planting. In a good year, the inundation would recede by autumn, leaving behind a thick layer of black fertile mud. Farmers would enthusiastically fling seed into this rich soil, reaping bountiful harvests of wheat, barley, and vegetables to fill both their bellies and their tax coffers. But the Nile was notoriously fickle. Sometimes the floods were disappointingly anemic, barely moistening the parched landscape. The crops would wither pathetically in their furrows, leaving the terrifying specter of famine looming ominously over the valley. Other times, the river would surge catastrophically high, drowning seedlings, livestock, and unfortunate villagers caught in its roaring path. The very first pharaoh of a unified Egypt, King Narmer, learned this harsh lesson around 3000 BC. According to ancient legend, one particularly troubling summer, the Nile's flood failed completely, shrinking to a mere trickle between its sun-baked banks. Crops withered and died. Herds of cattle wasted away to skin and bone, and his desperate subjects began to starve. Narmer must have watched in mounting dread as the river receded more each day, the possibility of losing his freshly forged kingdom to drought and famine growing with each rainless day that passed. He ordered extensive prayers and lavish sacrifices to the gods, even commanding that a young virgin be thrown into the Nile as a desperate offering. Still, the river continued to shrink. At last, in absolute desperation, Narmer undertook a pilgrimage to the island of Elephantine, a traditional center of worship for the god Hapi. There, prostrating himself before the deity's statue, Narmer solemnly vowed to dedicate his realm and his reign to the Nile's everlasting glory. If only Hapi would bless Egypt with his life-giving waters once more, whether through divine intervention or fortunate timing, The rains finally arrived. The Nile swelled gloriously to its banks, and Egypt was delivered from certain disaster. But Narmer would not be the last pharaoh to learn the hard way that the Nile's bounty came at a steep price, a lesson felt most keenly not in the halls of power, but in the humble villages that lined the riverbanks, where the annual floods could spell the difference between prosperity and utter ruin. Consider the life of an ordinary farmer like Seneb, who might have lived in a small village near modern-day Luxor during the Middle Kingdom period. Seneb's entire existence revolved around the Nile's annual cycle. His modest mud brick home, shared with his wife, 4 children, and elderly parents, stood on slightly elevated ground near the river's edge. The single-room dwelling, with its packed earth floor and simple reed roof, offered minimal protection from the elements, but represented the sum total of his family's wealth and security. Each year, as the summer heat intensified, Seneb would anxiously watch the river for the first signs of the inundation. Too little water meant certain hardship, fields that couldn't be properly irrigated, crops that would fail, and hungry months ahead. Too much water could be equally devastating, flooding his home, drowning his few precious animals, and possibly carrying away family members caught in the sudden surge. The year's first sign of the flood's arrival would come with a subtle change in the river's color, shifting from clear to a reddish-brown as it carried silt from the Ethiopian highlands. Seneb and his neighbors would immediately begin preparations, moving valuable possessions to higher ground, reinforcing their homes with additional mud bricks, and securing their animals. As the waters rose, Seneb's family would crowd into their increasingly cramped living space, now sharing it with their goats and chickens brought inside for protection. The stench would become nearly unbearable. Animal waste, human waste, and the damp, moldy smell of mud walls soaked by rising groundwater. Disease would spread rapidly in these conditions, particularly among the very young and very old. If the flood reached dangerous levels, Seneb might be forced to evacuate his family to higher ground, perhaps to a relative's home, farther from the river, or to a makeshift camp on elevated land. There they would join other displaced villagers, sharing limited resources and watching anxiously as the waters continued to rise, wondering if they would have homes to return to when the flood receded. When the waters finally began to retreat, Seneb would wade through the mud to assess the damage. In a good year, his home would still be standing, though in need of significant repairs. In a bad year, he might find nothing but a collapsed pile of mud bricks, representing months of work and the loss of his family's shelter. Either way, he couldn't dwell on the destruction for long. The receding flood left behind the fertile black soil that would feed his family for the coming year. Within days of the waters retreating, Seneb would be in the fields, working from dawn until dusk to prepare the ground and plant the seeds before the soil dried out. His wife and children would work alongside him, even the youngest contributing to this critical task. The months following the flood were a time of back-breaking labor, but also cautious hope. If the gods were kind and the harvest plentiful, Seneb's family would eat well, and perhaps even have surplus to trade for small luxuries, a bronze tool, a piece of jewelry for his wife, or a toy for his children. If the harvest failed, they faced starvation, or at best, dependence on the uncertain charity of neighbors or temple granaries. And through it all, Seneb knew that regardless of how hard he worked or how bountiful his harvest, a significant portion of his crops would be claimed by tax collectors, representing the distant pharaoh. The scribe would arrive with his papyrus scroll and measuring cord, calculating Seneb's tax burden with mathematical precision that left no room for appeal or mercy. This was the reality of life along the Nile for millions of ordinary Egyptians, a constant cycle of hope and fear, abundance and scarcity, all dictated by the river's unpredictable moods. The Nile gave life, but it also took it away, a capricious deity that demanded respect and sacrifice from all who depended on its waters. The harsh realities of life in ancient Egypt extended far beyond the unpredictable Nile to their profound beliefs about the afterlife as well. The Egyptians were utterly obsessed with death and what might come after. They believed that upon dying, their souls would face a harrowing journey through the treacherous underworld, filled with fearsome monsters and perilous tests, before hopefully reaching the paradise of the field of reeds. But even this ultimate reward was not guaranteed. First, the deceased's heart would be weighed on a ceremonial scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found heavier than the feather, weighed down by sin and unrighteousness, it would be immediately devoured by the demon Ammon, a terrifying beast with the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, and the back legs of a hippopotamus. To be consumed by Ammon meant suffering a second, permanent death, vanishing into oblivion for eternity, never to reach the coveted afterlife. As a result, Egyptians devoted enormous energy and precious resources towards ensuring a successful passage to the next world. Tombs and burial chambers were painstakingly prepared and generously stocked with grave goods like food, furniture, jewelry, and figurines representing servants, all the necessities and luxuries they would need for eternity. The walls were meticulously painted with spells and inscriptions from the Book of the Dead to guide and protect the deceased on their perilous underworld journey. The most crucial step in this elaborate process was mummification. Egyptians firmly believed that the soul needed an intact earthly body to return to in the afterlife. So after death, the corpse would undergo an extensive embalming process to preserve it for eternity. The internal organs would be carefully removed, the body methodically dried in natron salts, then wrapped in multiple layers of linen soaked in protective resins. Even for the wealthy, this sacred rite was an expensive, lengthy, and complex procedure, lasting up to 70 days. For the pharaohs, absolutely no expense was spared in safeguarding their eternal life. Perhaps the most extravagant example was King Tutankhamun, the famed boy king who ruled in the 14th century BC. Although he died unexpectedly at only 19 years of age, he was still interred in a multi-chambered, treasure-filled tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Over 5,000 precious objects were buried with him, including 6 ornate chariots, elaborate thrones, priceless jewelry, intricate statues, fine furniture, elegant clothes, and deadly weapons, not to mention the magnificent nested coffins and the iconic golden death mask that has become synonymous with ancient Egypt itself. When Howard Carter unsealed Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the dazzling golden treasures captivated the entire world, but they also reflected the Egyptians' endless efforts to secure their fragile shot at eternal life. And Tutankhamun was just a short-lived minor king who died before reaching his prime. Imagine what must have been buried with the truly great pharaohs like Khufu, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II, who ruled for decades at the height of Egyptian power. Sadly, most of their tombs were thoroughly looted in antiquity. Precious grave goods were stolen, the mummies damaged or scattered. Even King Tutankhamun's tomb had been infiltrated by robbers twice before its final sealing, though they were apparently disturbed before they could complete their theft. The fear of tomb robbery was a constant specter that haunted the Egyptians. They built cleverly hidden entrances, false doors and passages, deep shafts, and decoy chambers to thwart determined thieves. Armed guards were posted at royal necropoli, and priests made offerings to the deceased kings daily. Elaborately worded curses were carved into tomb walls, invoking the terrible wrath of the gods on any who dared desecrate the sacred resting places. And with good reason, the punishments for grave robbing were among the most brutal in Egyptian law. Convicted tomb raiders faced horrific executions. Their bodies were then denied proper burial to doom their own hopes for the afterlife. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus tells the grim tale of the funeral of Ramesses II around 1213 BC. Diodorus writes that during the procession, the king's son noticed a thief tunneling into the royal tomb. The prince could have stopped him immediately, but instead let him continue so he could later capture the entire gang in the act. When the trap was finally sprung, the thieves faced a ghastly fate. Diodorus recounts, "The king gave orders that the robbers should all promptly be put to a horrible death to deter any others from like attempts. They were placed still living on skewers and roasted to death over a slow fire, a lurid warning to any who dared cross the sacred boundary between this world and the next." Even the vast hidden cemeteries and secret tomb shafts in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings couldn't stop the determined robberies. During the reign of Ramesses IX in the 12th century BC, tomb raiding had grown so frequent and brazen that the king was forced to dispatch a special commission to investigate. A scribe named Passer was sent out to inspect the royal tombs, and he returned with an alarming report of widespread looting. Passer found the mummies of great kings and queens of the past cast out of their coffins, dumped ignobly on the ground, stripped of their jewels and protective amulets. Their unwrapped corpses lay twisted and moldering, prey to rats and jackals. Even the mummy of the mighty Ramesses II had been vandalized, his onyx and precious stone eyes pried out by greedy hands. The investigators rounded up scores of suspects, from lowly stone cutters and woodworkers to the mayor and high priest of Thebes. The confession of one gold worker, named Amenhotep, reveals the sheer audacity of the tomb robbers. He admitted, "We tunneled into the corridors of the tomb of King Sobekemsaf. We found the king's mummy within, adorned with gold and many jewels. We stripped off the gold and jewels that we found on the mummy of the god, as well as the amulets and ornaments which were around his neck. We found the royal wife likewise. We stripped off all that we found upon her too. We set fire to their mummy cases, and we stole their furniture, which we found with them, vases of gold, silver, and bronze." The robbers seemed completely undeterred by the risk of divine retribution or gruesome execution. The golden allure was simply too tempting in a world of such scarcity and hardship. Even the sacred sleep of the pharaohs could not rest undisturbed. So, perhaps the Egyptians' obsession with death was well-founded. They poured their hopes into the hereafter because their reality in this life was often so brutally unforgiving. For kings and commoners alike, the specter of death loomed large and constant. Mummification was a desperate grasp at immortality, and the lavish tombs a priceless insurance policy for a peaceful, eternal rest after a lifetime of toil and uncertainty. But in the end, not even the mummies were safe from the long hand of grave robbers and the unrelenting hardships of life along the Nile. The afterlife was the ancient Egyptians' only refuge from the cruelties of this world, and even that was a gamble not all would win. But Tutankhamun at least rested undisturbed for over 3,200 years, until Howard Carter made his famous discovery. And now, the boy king lives again, immortalized in exhibits seen by millions, a gilded relic from a harsher age. And so, as we drift off to sleep tonight, in the comfort of our modern lives, we can appreciate the immense distance between our world and theirs, and marvel at what the Egyptians endured in their eternal reach for life, everlasting on the shifting sands of the Nile. To truly understand the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife, let us follow the journey of a wealthy merchant named Amenemhat as he prepares for his own death during the New Kingdom period. At 55 years of age, Amenemhat has achieved considerable success in life. His trading ventures along the Nile and into the Levant have brought him substantial wealth. He owns a comfortable villa in Thebes, several boats, and employs numerous servants. By the standards of his time, he has lived a long and prosperous life. But Amenemhat is growing increasingly anxious. A persistent cough and occasional chest pains suggest his time in this world may be drawing to a close. Unlike modern people who might seek medical treatment or deny thoughts of mortality, Amenemhat turns his attention fully to preparing for the next world. For him, death is not the end, but a transition, one that requires meticulous preparation. His first concern is securing an appropriate tomb, having accumulated sufficient wealth. Amenemhat has already purchased a modest tomb in the Theban necropolis, carved into the hillside west of the Nile. For the past 5 years, artisans have been working to decorate its walls with scenes depicting his life achievements and religious imagery to aid his journey through the underworld. Now, sensing his time growing short, Amenemhat increases their wages to speed the work. He visits the site weekly, inspecting the progress and making adjustments to the decorative program. One wall shows him overseeing his trading ventures. Another depicts him making offerings to Osiris and Anubis. The ceiling is painted with astronomical symbols to help his soul navigate the night sky. Each image has both aesthetic and functional purpose. They are not mere decorations, but magical tools to ensure his successful transition to the afterlife. Simultaneously, Amenemhat begins collecting the grave goods that will accompany him into eternity. He commissions a finely crafted wooden coffin, painted with protective spells and images of deities. He selects his favorite furniture pieces, a comfortable chair, a bed, storage chests, to be placed in the tomb. He purchases dozens of Ushabti figurines, small servant statues that will magically animate to perform labor for him in the afterlife. His wife, Nefertari, oversees the preparation of linens for his mummy wrappings. The finest flax is spun and woven into cloth of exceptional quality, hundreds of yards will be needed for the complex wrapping process. Meanwhile, Amenemhat himself visits the temple to make generous donations, ensuring the priests will remember him with offerings after his death. Perhaps most importantly, Amenemhat commissions his own personalized copy of the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions to help navigate the perils of the underworld. This is no small expense. The papyrus alone is costly, and the specialized scribes who know the proper texts and illustrations charge substantial fees. But Amenemhat considers it essential insurance for his eternal journey. The completed scroll contains over 150 spells, each addressing specific challenges he might face. Spells to transform into different animals, to escape dangers, spells to remember his name when questioned by gatekeepers, spells to breathe in the underworld, and most crucially, spells to ensure his heart speaks favorably during the final judgment. As his health deteriorates, Amenemhat meets with the embalmers to arrange for his mummification. The cost is staggering. Nearly a quarter of his total wealth will go toward this process alone. The head embalmer explains the procedure in detail, how they will remove his internal organs, except the heart, which must remain for judgment, how they will dry his body with natron salt for 40 days, how they will pack his body cavity with linen and aromatic resins, and finally, how they will wrap him in layer upon layer of linen, placing protective amulets between the layers. Amenemhat also meets with the priests who will perform his funeral rites. He pays in advance for 70 days of offerings and prayers. He arranges for professional mourners to accompany his funeral procession. He even hires a Sem priest to perform the critical opening of the mouth, ceremony that will allow his mummy to eat, drink, and breathe in the afterlife. In his final weeks, Amenemhat finalizes his earthly affairs. He divides his remaining property among his children, with the understanding that a portion of their inheritance must be used for continued offerings at his tomb. He extracts promises from his eldest son to maintain these offerings and to defend the tomb against potential robbers. When death finally comes, Amenemhat's body is immediately taken to the house of purification, where the lengthy mummification process begins. His family enters a period of formal mourning, with his wife and daughters growing their hair disheveled and smearing their faces with dirt as signs of grief. 70 days later, the funeral procession winds its way from the embalming house to Amenemhat's tomb in the western hills. Professional mourners wail and throw dust in the air. Priests burn incense and recite prayers. Amenemhat's mummy, encased in its decorated coffin, is pulled on a sledge by a team of oxen. Behind it follow carts laden with all the grave goods that will accompany him to eternity. At the tomb entrance, the crucial opening of the mouth ceremony is performed. The priest touches various parts of the coffin with specialized tools, symbolically enabling Amenemhat's senses for the afterlife. Finally, the mummy and grave goods are placed inside the tomb. The entrance is sealed, and Amenemhat begins his journey through the underworld. For Amenemhat's family, the financial cost has been enormous. Perhaps 80% of his accumulated wealth has gone into his tomb, mummification, and funeral. But they consider it money well spent. Without these elaborate preparations, Amenemhat's soul might become lost in the underworld or fail the judgment before Osiris, suffering the second death of oblivion. This elaborate process, repeated countless times across 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, reveals how deeply the fear of death and hope for an afterlife shaped Egyptian society. The massive expenditure of resources on tombs and mortuary cults was not mere vanity, but a rational response to their understanding of cosmic reality. In a world where life was brutally hard and often short, the promise of an eternal, perfect existence in the field of reeds provided hope and meaning that made the hardships of this world more bearable. Life in ancient Egypt was fraught with uncertainty, hardship, and brutality. Even for powerful pharaohs like Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC, danger and struggle were never far away. Thutmose III was one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, leading at least 17 military campaigns during his long and prosperous run. He fought relentlessly to expand Egypt, his empire, and secure its borders against rival powers that constantly threatened the kingdom's stability and wealth. The Egyptians' most formidable foes during this tumultuous period were the Canaanite city-states in modern-day Syria and Palestine. After decades of growing Canaanite power and influence, Thutmose III decided a decisive reckoning was in order. In the spring of 1457 BC, he marched his armies out of Egypt and into Canaan to confront his enemies in what would become one of history's earliest well-documented military campaigns. But campaigning was a difficult and dangerous undertaking, even for a pharaoh surrounded by loyal guards and experienced commanders. Thutmose and his men faced grueling marches through the scorching Sinai desert. Water was scarce, and heat exhaustion took a heavy toll on both soldiers and animals. When they finally reached the hill country of Canaan, Thutmose found his enemies waiting at the strategically positioned city of Megiddo. The Canaanites had gathered a massive coalition army with thousands of infantry and hundreds of war chariots. They occupied a strong defensive position with the steep slopes of Mount Carmel protecting their flanks, making a direct assault extremely hazardous. Thutmose had a critical strategic decision to make. He could take the easy route and march his army around the mountain, avoiding the enemy's strong point, but giving them valuable time to escape or prepare further. Or he could take the risky path, a narrow, winding mountain pass that led directly to Megiddo. It would mean squeezing his entire army through a tight canyon where they could be easily ambushed from above, a military nightmare that his generals strongly advised against. In a daring gamble that demonstrated his boldness as a commander, Thutmose chose the direct route despite the obvious dangers. As the Egyptians threaded their way through the treacherous pass, the Canaanites attacked from the high ground. Arrows, sling stones, and boulders rained down from the cliffs above. Men and horses screamed as they were struck down, the narrow defile turning into a bloody killing zone where escape was impossible and advance seemed suicidal. But Thutmose urged his army forward, leading from the front to inspire his men. Bleeding and battered, they eventually passed through the gauntlet and spilled out onto the plain in front of Megiddo. There they met the main Canaanite coalition in open battle, where Egyptian military discipline and superior tactics could be brought to bear. The clash was long and bloody, with particularly heavy fighting between the elite chariot forces on both sides. But Thutmose's military skill and the tenacity of his battle-hardened soldiers eventually won the day. The Egyptians routed the Canaanites and pursued them to the city gates in a chaotic route. Thutmose later boasted that his enemies were scattered like chaff before the wind. He claimed to have personally captured 340 enemy prisoners and seized 2,041 horses and 924 chariots, an enormous haul of valuable military equipment. But the victory came at a steep price. Many Egyptian soldiers never returned home to their families. Some died in the mountain pass, others on the battlefield. The wounded suffered terribly, treated with primitive medical techniques that often led to infection and slow death. Even for the survivors, the campaign meant months away from home, sleeping on hard ground, eating poor rations, and living in constant fear of ambush or disease. And Thutmose's campaign was just one of countless military operations that characterized Egypt's long history. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian armies marched to war against Nubians, Libyans, Hittites, Sea Peoples, Assyrians, and many others. Each campaign brought glory and plunder to the victors, but also death, suffering, and grief to thousands of ordinary families. For the common Egyptian soldier, war was particularly brutal. Conscripted from their farms and workshops, these men received minimal training before being thrust into battle. They fought with simple weapons, wooden shields, spears, and copper or bronze-tipped arrows. Their leather or cloth armor provided little protection against the deadly bronze weapons of their enemies. Battle injuries were horrific. Skulls crushed by maces, limbs severed by battle axes, bodies pierced by arrows and spears. Archaeological evidence from ancient Egyptian battlefields reveals the grim reality of warfare in this era. Skeletal remains show devastating head wounds, broken bones, and severed limbs. Many skeletons bear the marks of multiple healed fractures, suggesting that some soldiers survived serious injuries only to be sent back into battle once they recovered. Medical treatments for the wounded were primitive by modern standards. Egyptian physicians used honey as an antiseptic and applied plant poultices to wounds. Broken bones were set with wooden splints. But without effective antibiotics, many wounds became infected. Gangrene was common, often leading to agonizing deaths. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, using copper saws, with hot oil used to cauterize the stumps. Those who survived their wounds often faced a lifetime of disability. Ancient Egyptian art occasionally depicts veterans with missing limbs or walking with canes, suggesting that some disabled soldiers did survive to return home. But in a society that valued physical labor and where most work required bodily strength, these men faced significant challenges reintegrating into civilian life. The psychological toll of combat was equally devastating, though less visible in the historical record. Egyptian texts make occasional references to soldiers who returned from war with their hearts changed, perhaps an ancient recognition of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. These men had witnessed horrors that most civilians could scarcely imagine. The screams of the dying, the smell of blood and viscera, the terror of facing an enemy determined to kill them. For the families left behind, war brought different hardships. Wives struggled to maintain farms and workshops in their husbands' absence. Children grew up without fathers, and many received the devastating news that their loved ones would never return, their bodies left unburied on distant battlefields. A particularly terrible fate in a culture that placed such emphasis on proper burial rites. Even in victory, war brought suffering. Egyptian armies, returning from successful campaigns, often brought captured enemies back as slaves. These unfortunate prisoners faced a lifetime of hard labor in mines, quarries, or construction projects. Women captives frequently became concubines or domestic servants, torn from their families and homelands. The monuments that modern tourists admire, the temples, palaces, and tombs, were built in part through the spoils of war and the labor of captives. The gold that adorned Egyptian temples was often plundered from conquered territories. The massive building projects that we marvel at today were made possible by the exploitation of war prisoners working alongside Egyptian laborers. So while we might admire the military prowess of pharaohs like Thutmose III, we should remember that their glorious victories came at an enormous human cost. For every triumphant scene carved on temple walls showing the pharaoh smiting his enemies, thousands of ordinary people, Egyptian and foreign alike, suffered and died. War in ancient Egypt, as in all pre-modern societies, was not the sanitized, distant affair that we sometimes imagine, but a close, personal, and brutally violent experience that touched countless lives. Let us consider the experience of Nakht, a common soldier conscripted from his small farming village in the Nile Delta to serve in Thutmose III's army at 22 years of age. Nakht had never traveled more than a few miles from his birthplace. His world consisted of his small mud brick home, the surrounding fields where he worked alongside his father and brothers, and the local village market. His knowledge of writing was limited to recognizing a few hieroglyphs, and his understanding of the wider world came primarily from occasional travelers' tales heard at the village well. When the royal officials arrived with their papyrus scrolls listing the names of men to be conscripted, Nakht had little choice but to comply. Resistance meant severe punishment, possibly execution. His wife, Merit, pregnant with their first child, wept as he prepared to leave, knowing she might never see him again. His elderly parents worried not only about his safety, but about how they would manage the farm without his strong back and skilled hands. Nakht was given 5 days to put his affairs in order before reporting to the assembly point at the nearest large town. There he joined hundreds of other conscripts, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, all equally apprehensive about what lay ahead. Few had any military experience beyond village brawls or hunting expeditions. Their training was cursory at best. For 2 weeks, they practiced marching in formation, learned basic commands, and received rudimentary instruction in using shields and spears. The more promising recruits, particularly those with hunting experience, were selected for archery training. Nakht, having demonstrated skill with a throwing stick in bird hunting, was assigned to a unit of spearmen. The equipment issued to Nakht was simple: a wooden shield covered with animal hide, a copper-tipped spear, a short dagger, and a linen kilt, reinforced with leather strips for minimal protection. No helmet, no body armor. Such equipment was reserved for professional soldiers and the elite chariot warriors. Common infantry like Nakht were essentially expendable, expected to absorb enemy attacks through sheer numbers rather than individual skill or protection. The march to Canaan was Nakht's first experience of true hardship. Accustomed to the fertile, well-watered Nile Valley, he found the Sinai Desert almost unbearable. The daily water ration was barely sufficient, and soldiers who drank more than their share faced brutal punishment. Many collapsed from heat exhaustion. Some never rose again. The nights were bitterly cold, and Nakht huddled with his fellow villagers for warmth, all of them wondering if they would survive to see Egypt again. Food consisted primarily of hard bread, dried fish, and occasional wild game hunted along the way. Dysentery spread rapidly through the ranks, weakening men already struggling with the harsh conditions. Nacht himself suffered for several days, marching with fever and constant diarrhea, afraid to report his illness, lest he be left behind or punished for weakness. By the time they reached Canaan, Nacht's unit had already lost nearly a fifth of its men to illness, exhaustion, and desertion. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down by the military police and executed before the assembled troops as a warning. Nacht had witnessed 3 such executions, the condemned men begging for mercy as they were impaled on spears, a sight that haunted his dreams. When the order came to advance through the narrow pass at Megiddo, Nacht found himself in the middle of the column, surrounded by equally terrified comrades. The first indication of attack was a shower of arrows and stones from above. Men fell screaming around him. A stone struck his shield with such force that it splintered the wood and numbed his arm. An arrow grazed his thigh, leaving a burning line of pain. The column compressed as men instinctively huddled together for protection, making them better targets for the Canaanite missiles. Officers shouted for them to keep moving forward, striking laggards with the flat of their swords. Nacht stumbled over bodies of the fallen, slipping in pools of blood. The pass echoed with screams, prayers, and the thud of projectiles striking flesh and wood. When they finally emerged onto the plain, Nacht's unit had been reduced by half. There was no time to rest or tend wounds. The Canaanite army awaited them, and Thutmose immediately ordered his forces into battle formation. Nacht found himself in the center of the Egyptian line, shield locked with those of his comrades, spear poised for the advance. The battle itself became a blur of noise, dust, and terror. Nacht remembered fragments, the ground shaking as chariot forces clashed on the flanks, the wall of Canaanite infantry advancing toward them with spears leveled, the deafening crash as the 2 forces met, the man beside him taking a spear through the throat, blood spraying across Nacht's face, his own spear finding purchase in an enemy's chest, the strange resistance as he pulled it free. At some point, Nacht took a blow to the head that left him dazed. He fought on instinctively, the training and fear overriding conscious thought. When the Canaanites finally broke and fled, Nacht was still standing, though he couldn't clearly recall the final phase of the battle. His shield was shattered, his spear lost, his dagger bloody to the hilt. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, though none appeared life-threatening. The aftermath was almost worse than the battle. The field was littered with the dead and dying. Wounded men screamed for water or begged for death to end their suffering. Egyptian physicians moved among the injured, treating those who might survive, administering opium to ease the pain of the mortally wounded. Nacht helped carry his wounded comrades to the treatment area, recognizing faces from his village among the mangled bodies. That night, Nacht couldn't sleep, despite his exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the Canaanite soldier he had killed, a young man not much different from himself, probably also conscripted and thrown into battle. With minimal training, he wondered if that man had a wife waiting for him, parents who would never see their son again. For the first time, Nacht understood that the enemy were men just like himself, not the inhuman monsters described in Egyptian propaganda. The siege of Megiddo lasted 7 months. Nacht's role shifted from combat soldier to laborer, constructing the earthworks that surrounded the city and prevented supplies from reaching the defenders. The work was hard, but less terrifying than direct combat. Still, disease swept through the Egyptian camp, claiming almost as many lives as the battle had. Nacht contracted a fever that left him delirious for days, surviving only because a fellow villager shared his water ration and stole extra food for him. When Megiddo finally surrendered, Nacht witnessed the aftermath of conquest. The Canaanite leaders were executed, their heads displayed on poles outside Thutmose's tent. Young women were selected for the harems of Egyptian officers or as slaves to be sent back to Egypt. Men and boys were bound in chains, destined for labor gangs. Watching this, Nacht felt no triumph, only a weary relief that he had survived and might someday return home. The journey back to Egypt was almost as arduous as the outward march, though now they were burdened with plunder and prisoners. Nacht was assigned to guard a group of Canaanite captives, men who had fought against him months earlier, but were now broken, shuffling figures with empty eyes. He found he couldn't hate them as he was expected to. Instead, he sometimes secretly shared his water ration when the overseers weren't watching, recognizing their common humanity. When Nacht finally returned to his village after nearly a year away, he was a changed man. Physically, he bore scars and a slight limp from an untreated wound that had healed poorly. Psychologically, the transformation was even more profound. He found it difficult to discuss his experiences with those who hadn't shared them. His nights were disturbed by vivid nightmares of the battle. Loud noises made him flinch and reach for a weapon no longer at his side. His wife had given birth to their son during his absence, and Nacht struggled to connect with this child, who was both his, but also a stranger. Merritt noticed how her husband would sometimes stare blankly into the distance. Lost in memories he refused to share. His parents commented that he had returned with a shadow on his spirit, their way of describing the psychological trauma of war. Nacht was one of the fortunate ones who physically survived the campaign, but like countless veterans throughout history, he would carry the invisible wounds of war for the rest of his life, and his experience was multiplied thousands of times across Egypt's long history, as ordinary men were conscripted to fight and die for the glory of pharaohs in distant lands they had never heard of before being called to arms. Beyond the battlefield, everyday life in ancient Egypt held countless other dangers. The home itself, supposedly a place of safety and comfort, concealed numerous hazards that modern people would find shocking. The typical Egyptian dwelling was constructed from mud bricks dried in the sun, an effective building material in Egypt's arid climate, but one with significant drawbacks. These structures were vulnerable to the rare but devastating flash floods that occasionally swept through villages. Without warning, walls could dissolve and entire homes collapse, burying families beneath tons of mud and debris. During the annual Nile flood, houses near the riverbank were particularly vulnerable, with water gradually weakening foundations until catastrophic failure occurred. Even in dry conditions, structural collapses were not uncommon. Roof beams sagged and broke under their own weight, especially in older dwellings. Support columns cracked and gave way. For the poorest Egyptians, who could not afford regular maintenance of their modest homes. The risk of being crushed by falling debris was a constant concern. Fire presented another ever-present danger. Egyptian homes were filled with flammable materials, reed mats, linen textiles, wooden furniture, and papyrus scrolls. Cooking was done over open flames, and lighting came from oil lamps and tallow candles, all potential sources of ignition. Without organized fire brigades or modern extinguishing equipment, a small kitchen fire could quickly engulf an entire neighborhood. The ancient Egyptian home was also shared with numerous unwelcome guests, scorpions and venomous snakes, including the deadly cobra and viper, frequently sought shelter in the cool, dark corners of Egyptian houses. Their bites could be fatal, especially to children and the elderly. Archaeological evidence suggests that scorpion stings were a leading cause of death among young children. Egyptians developed elaborate magical spells and protective amulets to ward off these creatures. One popular household item was the sippus, a protective stela showing the god Horus trampling crocodiles and grasping dangerous serpents and scorpions. These were believed to provide magical protection against venomous creatures, but of course offered no actual defense against a cobra hiding in a sandal or a scorpion nestled in bedding. Insects and rodents brought additional problems. Flies spread disease, mosquitoes transmitted malaria, and fleas carried typhus. Rats and mice consumed precious food stores and contaminated what they didn't eat. Without effective pesticides or sealed food containers, Egyptians fought a constant, losing battle against these pests. The very food that sustained life could also bring death. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly in Egypt's hot climate. Contaminated meat, fish, and dairy products caused severe food poisoning. Grain stored in damp conditions developed toxic molds. Water drawn from stagnant pools or contaminated sections of the Nile harbored deadly bacteria and parasites. One particularly gruesome intestinal parasite, schistosomiasis, infected countless Egyptians who bathed in or drank from the Nile. This debilitating disease caused intense abdominal pain, bloody urine, and eventually led to liver and kidney failure. Modern studies of Egyptian mummies have found evidence of schistosomiasis in up to 40% of examined remains, suggesting its widespread prevalence. Even the air Egyptians breathed posed health risks. During the dry season, dust storms blanketed villages and cities, filling lungs with irritating particles. Those who worked in mines, quarries, or construction projects inhaled stone dust daily, leading to silicosis and other respiratory diseases. Examination of mummified lung tissue has revealed severe anthracosis, black lung disease, in many ancient Egyptians, particularly craftsmen and laborers. For women, childbirth represented perhaps the greatest danger of all. Without modern medical care, complications during delivery frequently resulted in the death of mother, child, or both. Egyptian medical papyri contain numerous spells and treatments related to childbirth, revealing both the frequency of problems and the limited effective interventions available. Pregnant women sought protection from Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, wearing amulets bearing her image and reciting protective spells. But when complications arose, breech births, hemorrhaging, infections, these supernatural protections proved inadequate. Skeletal remains of women from ancient Egypt frequently show evidence of death during childbirth. and many female mummies bear signs of childbirth-related injuries. Children who survived birth faced daunting odds. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high by modern standards, with perhaps 30% of children dying before their first birthday, and 50% not surviving to adulthood. Childhood diseases that are easily treatable today, diarrhea, respiratory infections, measles, were often fatal. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making recovery from even minor illnesses less likely. Parents tried desperately to protect their children with amulets, spells, and prayers to protective deities like Bes and Taweret. They gave their children names like May He Live and the Distant One to confuse death spirits. But these measures provided little actual protection against the biological realities of disease in a pre-modern society. For those fortunate enough to reach adulthood, work brought its own hazards. Farmers risked injury from agricultural tools and attacks by hippopotamuses or crocodiles lurking in irrigation canals. Craftsmen suffered burns, cuts, and crushed limbs. Construction workers fell from scaffolding or were crushed by massive stone blocks. Miners labored in poorly ventilated shafts where cave-ins were common and toxic dust filled their lungs. One particularly dangerous profession was that of the scribe who mixed pigments for painting tombs and temples. Many of these pigments contained toxic minerals like lead, mercury, and arsenic. Constant exposure led to chronic poisoning, causing tremors, cognitive impairment, and eventually death. Yet ironically, scribes were considered fortunate compared to manual laborers, as their work was less physically demanding. Medical care for injuries and illnesses was primitive by modern standards. Though advanced for its time, Egyptian physicians combined practical treatments with magical incantations, seeing no contradiction between the two approaches. Some of their methods were surprisingly effective. Honey for wound dressing, willow bark containing salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, for pain relief, moldy bread containing natural antibiotics, applied to infected wounds. But many common treatments were ineffective or actively harmful. Open wounds were sometimes treated with animal dung, introducing dangerous bacteria. Toxic minerals like lead and copper were ingredients in many medicines. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits, was performed for headaches and seizures, often with fatal results. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, dating from around 1600 BC, reveals the limitations of Egyptian medical knowledge. While it contains rational treatments for bone fractures and surface wounds, it advises that deeper injuries to the chest or abdomen should not be treated, as they were considered inevitably fatal. For many serious conditions, physicians could offer only pain relief and comfort as the patient died. Even the wealthy and powerful were not immune to these dangers. The mummy of Ramesses II shows evidence of severe dental abscesses that would have caused excruciating pain. Tutankhamun suffered from malaria and a congenital foot deformity. Queen Hatshepsut likely died from bone cancer that had metastasized throughout her body. Their wealth could buy them the best medical care available, but that care was still woefully inadequate by modern standards. In this environment of constant danger and limited medical options, it's little wonder that Egyptians turned to magic and religion for protection. Households were filled with protective amulets. Prayers and offerings to gods and goddesses were daily rituals. Magic spells were recited to ward off disease and injury. These practices reflected a people desperately trying to exert some control over a world filled with invisible threats and sudden death. Consider the experience of Nefertiti, a young mother living in a modest home in a village near modern-day Luxor during the New Kingdom period. At 24, she has already given birth to 4 children, though only 2 have survived past infancy. Her days revolve around caring for her family, preparing food, fetching water, and assisting her husband with his work as a potter. Nefertiti's home, like most in her village, is a simple structure of mud brick with a flat roof made of wooden beams covered with palm fronds and mud. The single main room serves as living space, sleeping area, and sometimes workspace. A small courtyard contains a clay oven for baking bread and a grinding stone for processing grain. The family's few possessions, reed mats for sleeping, some clay pots, a wooden chest for clothing, and a small shrine to household deities, are kept neatly arranged against the walls. Each morning before dawn, Nefertiti rises to rekindle the cooking fire. This daily task carries its own dangers. Sparks can ignite the dry reed mats or her linen clothing. Once, when her oldest child was an infant, a spark landed on his blanket while she was distracted. The blanket began to smolder, and only Nefertiti's quick action in smothering the ember prevented a potentially fatal fire. After preparing a simple breakfast of bread and beer for her husband, Nefertiti's next task is fetching water from the Nile. She places her large clay jar on her head and walks with other village women to the riverbank. The Nile provides life-giving water, but also harbors invisible dangers. Nefertiti has heard the priests explain that water demons can enter the body through the feet when wading in the river, causing the bloody urine and swollen abdomen that afflict many villagers, symptoms we now recognize as schistosomiasis. She tries to minimize her time in the water, but complete avoidance is impossible given her daily needs. Returning home with her heavy water jar, Nefertiti begins preparing the day's main meal. The grain she uses must be carefully inspected for insects and mold. Once, during a particularly damp season, the family's stored grain developed a strange black fungus. They ate it anyway, having no alternative, and suffered days of painful stomach cramps and bloody diarrhea. Her youngest child, already weakened by a recent fever, did not survive this episode. As Nefertiti grinds the grain on her stone quern, the fine dust irritates her lungs, causing her to cough. Years of this daily task have given her a persistent cough that worsens during the dry season. The flour itself often contains tiny stone particles from the grinding process, which gradually wear down the family's teeth, leading to painful abscesses as bacteria enter through the damaged enamel. While preparing the dough for bread, Nefertiti keeps a watchful eye on her children playing in the courtyard. Her 3-year-old son has a habit of putting things in his mouth, and the ground is a minefield of hazards: sharp pottery shards, animal droppings, and potentially venomous creatures. Just last month, the child of a neighbor died after being stung by a scorpion that had hidden in a pile of clothing. For protection against such dangers, Nefertiti has placed a small statue of Bes, the dwarf god who protects households, near the entrance to their home. Around her son's neck hangs an amulet shaped like the Eye of Horus, believed to offer general protection. When she puts her children to bed each night, she recites a protective spell she learned from her mother. Back, O poison, come not forth, I am Horus. I have stepped on you. You shall not rise. Nefertiti's 5-year-old daughter helps with household tasks, learning the skills she will need as a future wife and mother. Today, the girl is helping to clean the sleeping mats by beating them with a stick to remove dust and insects. This releases clouds of dust containing mites, flea eggs, and dried rodent droppings, all potential sources of disease. The girl has recently developed a persistent cough similar to her mother's. As the hottest part of the day approaches, Nefertiti moves her food preparation to the shadiest part of the courtyard. The interior of their home becomes stifling in the midday heat. The mud brick walls, while providing good insulation, can reach temperatures that make them too hot to touch. Heat stroke is a common killer during summer months, particularly among the elderly and very young. While working in the courtyard, Nefertiti must remain vigilant against another danger: the neighbor's dog, which has shown signs of strange behavior recently, foaming at the mouth and acting aggressively, likely symptoms of rabies. Several villagers have already been bitten, and one is now seriously ill with fever and an intense fear of water. There is no treatment for this condition, which invariably ends in an agonizing death. As evening approaches, Nefertiti's husband returns from his workshop, bringing with him his own occupational hazards. His hands are cracked and bleeding from constant exposure to clay and water. His lungs are damaged from years of inhaling the fine dust from dried clay and the smoke from his kiln. He complains of pain in his back and knees from hours of sitting in a hunched position at his potter's wheel. The family's evening meal is eaten quickly before darkness falls. Oil for their simple clay lamp is expensive, so they try to complete most activities during daylight hours. The lamp itself is another fire hazard, easily knocked over by children or nocturnal animals that might enter the home. Before sleep, Nefertiti checks the corners of their home for scorpions and snakes, which often seek the relative coolness of human dwellings during hot weather. She shakes out the sleeping mats and carefully inspects the children's bedding. Despite these precautions, she knows that danger might still lurk unseen in the darkness. As she lies down beside her husband and children on their reed mats, Nefertiti offers a final prayer to the household gods for protection through the night. She is exhausted from the day's labor, but also anxious about what tomorrow might bring. She is in the early stages of another pregnancy and knows all too well the dangers that lie ahead. The village midwife has already warned her that this birth might be difficult, as her previous delivery resulted in several days of bleeding that nearly claimed her life. This is the reality of daily existence for ordinary Egyptians, a constant negotiation with danger, a daily struggle against forces both visible and invisible that threaten life and health. Modern visitors to Egypt marvel at the magnificent temples and tombs, but few consider the precarious lives led by those who built and maintained this extraordinary civilization. The rigid social hierarchy of ancient Egypt was perhaps one of the most oppressive aspects of daily life for the majority of its inhabitants. Unlike our modern notions of social mobility, ancient Egyptians were born into their social class and, with rare exceptions, remained there for life. This stratified society resembled a steep pyramid, much like the monuments they built, with the pharaoh at the apex and the masses of peasants and slaves forming the broad base. At the very top stood the god king himself, the pharaoh, believed to be the living embodiment of the god Horus and the divine intermediary between the gods and mortals. Far from being merely a political ruler, the pharaoh was considered semi-divine, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance of the universe. When Egyptians bowed before their king, they weren't merely showing respect to a powerful man, they were prostrating themselves before a living god. The pharaoh's power was absolute and unquestioned. He owned all the land of Egypt in theory, controlled its resources, led its armies, and served as the chief priest of every temple. His word was law, and disobedience was not merely treason, but sacrilege. The pharaoh lived in unimaginable luxury, surrounded by courtiers, eager to fulfill his every whim. His palaces were architectural marvels, filled with the finest furniture, art, and textiles. His meals were prepared by dedicated chefs using the freshest ingredients. His body was tended by personal physicians and adorned with gold, precious stones, and the finest linen. Yet even this seemingly perfect existence had its dark side. Pharaohs lived under constant threat of assassination from ambitious relatives or officials. They were expected to maintain Egypt's prosperity through proper religious observances and military victories. Failure could lead to unrest or even rebellion, and they were never truly alone, constantly surrounded by servants, officials, and guards, a gilded cage of privilege and responsibility. Below the pharaoh stood the elite class, comprising perhaps 5% of the population. This group included high priests, viziers, chief ministers, nomarchs, regional governors, military commanders, and wealthy landowners. These individuals enjoyed tremendous privilege, living in spacious villas with gardens and pools, eating the finest foods, wearing elegant clothes, and commanding numerous servants. The elite were literate in a society where writing was a rare and valuable skill. They received formal education in specialized schools, learning not only reading and writing, but mathematics, astronomy, religious texts, and administrative techniques. This knowledge gave them near monopolistic control over government, religion, and record-keeping, the key institutions of power. Yet membership in the elite came with obligations. They served at the pharaoh's pleasure and could fall from favor suddenly and catastrophically. They were expected to fund building projects, supply troops for the army, and ensure that taxes were collected from their regions. Failure could result in demotion, confiscation of property, or even execution. The middle class of ancient Egypt was relatively small but important, consisting of skilled artisans, craftsmen, scribes of lower rank, merchants, and minor officials. These individuals possessed valuable skills or occupied necessary positions that afforded them a standard of living above the common peasantry, but well below the elite. A master craftsman who created jewelry for the royal court, for instance, might own a modest home and enjoy a diet that occasionally included meat and wine. A successful merchant trading luxury goods might accumulate enough wealth to live comfortably and even own a small plot of land. A mid-level scribe working in the temple administration might have enough income to afford a few luxuries and provide education for his sons. But this middle ground was precarious. Economic downturns, crop failures, or simply falling out of favor with a powerful patron could send a middle-class family tumbling back into the masses of peasantry. And while they enjoyed some comforts, they still lived under the absolute authority of the elite and ultimately the pharaoh. The vast majority of ancient Egyptians, perhaps 80% of the population, were peasant farmers who worked the land. Their lives were characterized by unrelenting physical labor, minimal comforts, and constant vulnerability to natural disasters and exploitation by their social superiors. The typical peasant family lived in a small mud brick house with dirt floors and few possessions. Their diet consisted primarily of bread, beer, onions, and occasional vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. They wore simple linen garments that they made themselves, often the same clothes for years until they literally fell apart. Their days followed the rhythm of the sun, beginning work at dawn and continuing until dusk. During the growing season, they planted, weeded, and harvested crops. During the flood season, when farming was impossible, they were conscripted for corvée labor on construction projects or maintenance of irrigation systems. Perhaps most oppressive was the tax burden they bore. Ancient Egyptian peasants typically surrendered between 20% and 50% of their harvest to the state. Tax assessors were notorious for their corruption, often demanding more than the official rate. Failure to pay could result in a brutal corporal punishment or being sold into slavery to cover the debt. Peasants had essentially no legal rights as we would understand them today. They could not appeal to independent courts for justice. They could be conscripted for labor or military service at any time. Their daughters could be taken as servants or concubines for the elite. Their testimony carried little weight against that of their social superiors. At the very bottom of Egyptian society were the slaves. Some were prisoners of war, others criminals, and some were Egyptians who had fallen into debt slavery. Their lives were entirely at the mercy of their owners, who could beat them, separate them from their families, or work them literally to death with few consequences. Slaves performed the most dangerous and degrading work, mining in remote desert regions, quarrying massive stones, rowing in military galleys, or serving in households where they were vulnerable to every form of abuse. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation, with little recourse or protection. Some slaves, particularly those with specialized skills or those serving in wealthy households, might eventually earn their freedom, or at least achieve a relatively stable position. But for most, slavery was a life sentence of misery and exploitation, ended only by death or the rare act of manumission by a generous owner. The social hierarchy was reinforced through numerous visible markers. The elite wore finer clothes, often bleached to a brilliant white, that common people could not achieve. They adorned themselves with jewelry and cosmetics, wore wigs made from human hair, and carried symbols of their authority. They spoke differently, using a more formal register of the Egyptian language, and often incorporating foreign loanwords to demonstrate their sophistication. Even in death, the social hierarchy persisted. The elite were mummified and buried in elaborate tombs with grave goods to ensure their comfort in the afterlife. Middle-class Egyptians might afford simple mummification and modest tombs. Peasants were typically wrapped in reed mats and buried in simple pits in the desert, with few, if any, grave goods. Slaves might not receive proper burial at all, their bodies disposed of with minimal ceremony. Perhaps most insidious was how this rigid hierarchy was justified and normalized through religion and ideology. Egyptians were taught that the social order was divinely ordained, a reflection of the cosmic order established by the gods at creation. To challenge one's place was not merely to rebel against earthly authorities, but to disrupt Ma'at itself, an act of cosmic sacrilege. The concept of Ma'at, truth, justice, and cosmic balance, paradoxically served to reinforce inequality. Egyptians were taught that accepting their assigned place in the hierarchy, however humble, was virtuous and would be rewarded in the afterlife. Ambition beyond one's station was portrayed as greedy and disruptive. This ideological control was remarkably effective, despite the extreme inequality and exploitation that characterized ancient Egyptian society. Major rebellions were surprisingly rare. When they did occur, they typically happened during periods of central government weakness, such as the intermediate periods, when the pharaoh's authority had already been undermined by other factors. So, while we marvel at the magnificent achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization, the pyramids, temples, and artistic masterpieces, we should remember that these wonders were built upon the backs of a society where the vast majority lived lives of hardship, exploitation, and limited opportunity, trapped in a social system that offered them little hope of advancement or relief. To understand how this rigid social hierarchy functioned in practice, let us follow a day in the life of 3 Egyptians from different social strata during the New Kingdom period, around 1350 BCE. First, we meet Amenhotep, a high-ranking official who serves as the overseer of the royal granaries in Thebes. Amenhotep's day begins in his spacious villa on the east bank of the Nile. He is awakened before dawn by his personal servant, who helps him wash with scented water from a copper basin. Another servant brings his clothing for the day, a pristine white linen kilt of the finest quality, a broad collar of gold and semi-precious stones, and sandals made from woven palm fibers. After dressing, Amenhotep is served breakfast in his courtyard garden, where a small fountain provides pleasant background sounds. His meal consists of fresh bread, honey, figs, and wine, luxuries that most Egyptians rarely taste. As he eats, a scribe reads him messages and reports that arrived overnight. Amenhotep dictates responses, never having to touch the writing implements himself. By mid-morning, Amenhotep is carried in a curtained sedan chair by 4 servants to the administrative buildings near the royal palace. Common people clear the street as he passes, bowing their heads in deference. At the granary complex, lesser officials wait nervously for his arrival, knowing that his favor can make or break their careers. Amenhotep spends his morning reviewing harvest projections, tax collections, and distribution records. When a discrepancy is found in the accounts, he orders the responsible scribe to be beaten with 20 lashes, a relatively mild punishment that nevertheless leaves the man bloody and humiliated. No one questions Amenhotep's authority to order such punishment on the spot. At midday, Amenhotep joins other high officials for a lavish lunch hosted by the vizier, the second most powerful man in Egypt after the pharaoh himself. They recline on cushioned chairs under a shaded pavilion served by silent slaves who keep their wine cups filled. The conversation revolves around court politics, recent military victories in Canaan, and speculation about who might be gaining or losing the pharaoh's favor. After lunch, Amenhotep visits the temple of Amun-Ra to make offerings. As a high official, he is permitted to enter parts of the temple forbidden to common people. A priest greets him by name and accepts his generous donation, promising that the god will look favorably upon him. This religious observance is as much political as spiritual. Maintaining good relations with a powerful priesthood is essential for anyone in Amenhotep's position. In the late afternoon, Amenhotep returns home to conduct personal business. He meets with an architect about expanding his tomb in the noble's cemetery, reviews the work of craftsmen creating furniture for his household, and grants an audience to several petitioners seeking his patronage or intervention in disputes. To one, a distant relative, he grants a minor administrative position. The others are dismissed with vague promises or outright refusals. As evening approaches, Amenhotep prepares to attend a banquet at the home of another noble. His servants dress him in fresh clothing, apply scented oils to his skin, and place an elaborate wig on his head. His wife, who has spent much of her day managing the household and overseeing the servants, joins him in equally fine attire. Together, they are carried to the banquet, where they will enjoy entertainment, rich food, and the company of their social equals until late in the night. Meanwhile, across the city, Nacht, the craftsman, begins his day in a very different manner. Nacht is a skilled woodworker who creates furniture for wealthy clients. His home is modest but comfortable, a two-room house in a neighborhood of similar artisans and craftsmen. He rises at dawn and eats a simple breakfast of bread and beer prepared by his wife. Nacht walks to his workshop, which he shares with two apprentices and his teenage son, who is learning the trade. Today, they are working on a ceremonial chair for a temple official, an important commission that could lead to more prestigious work if done well. Nacht carefully supervises the carving of lotus flower designs into the chair's legs, occasionally taking the tools himself to demonstrate proper technique. The work is physically demanding and precise. By midday, Nacht's back aches from bending over his work, and his hands are nicked from sharp tools, despite his expertise. The workshop is hot, filled with wood dust that irritates the lungs and eyes, but Nacht takes pride in his craftsmanship and knows that his skills provide his family with a standard of living above that of common laborers. At midday, Nacht's wife brings lunch to the workshop: bread, onions, and a small piece of dried fish to share among the workers. They eat quickly before returning to their tasks. In the afternoon, a minor noble visits to commission a storage chest. Nacht is respectful, but not servile. His skills give him a certain professional dignity in such interactions. They negotiate a price, with Nacht knowing exactly how low he can go while still making a profit. After work, Nacht stops at the local market to purchase a small jar of beer to share with his family. This is a small luxury he can afford as a successful craftsman. At home, his evening meal is simple but adequate: bread, vegetables from his wife's small garden, and lentils. Occasionally, on special days, they might enjoy a piece of meat. After dinner, Nacht sits in front of his house with neighbors, exchanging the news and stories as darkness falls. Unlike the elite, he owns no lamps and cannot afford to burn precious oil after sunset. When it becomes too dark to see, the family retires to sleep on reed mats inside their home, rising again with the sun to repeat the cycle. Far removed from both Amenhotep's luxury and Nacht's modest comfort is Renzi, a peasant farmer who works land belonging to the temple of Amun. Renzi lives with his extended family in a single-room mud brick hut on the edge of the fields he farms. His day begins before dawn, as he must walk to the fields while the temperature is still relatively cool. Renci's breakfast, prepared by his wife before he leaves, consists of a piece of coarse bread and a small amount of beer, the same basic diet he consumes at every meal, with little variation throughout the year except during rare festivals. The bread is often gritty, with sand from the grinding stones, gradually wearing down his teeth. Today, Renci and his sons are repairing irrigation channels in preparation for the coming inundation. The work is backbreaking, digging in hard soil with wooden tools, carrying heavy baskets of earth, standing for hours in water. The sun beats down mercilessly, and Renci's skin is deeply tanned and weathered from a lifetime of outdoor labor. At midday, the heat becomes nearly unbearable. Renci and his sons rest briefly in the shade of a sycamore tree, drinking water from clay pots and eating more bread brought by Renci's youngest daughter. Their rest is cut short by the appearance of an overseer from the temple, who reminds them that a section of the irrigation system must be completed by tomorrow. The afternoon brings more of the same grueling labor. Renci's back and joints ache constantly. At 40, he is already considered an old man, his body worn down by decades of physical toil. One of his sons has a festering wound on his foot from stepping on a sharp object, but there is no question of stopping work to seek treatment. The family's survival depends on maintaining the fields. As the sun begins to set, Renci and his sons finally return home. His wife and daughters have spent their day grinding grain, baking bread, drawing water from the river, and tending to their small vegetable garden. The family gathers for their evening meal: more bread, some onions, and a thin gruel made from vegetables. After eating, there is still work to be done: repairing tools, preparing seed for the next day's planting, tending to the family's few chickens, and perhaps a goat. By the time darkness falls completely, everyone is exhausted. The family sleeps crowded together on reed mats on the dirt floor, sharing body heat when nights are cool, and swatting at insects that invade their home. Renci falls asleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same labor, the same food, the same struggles. If the harvest is good, the family will have enough to eat after the temple takes its substantial share as tax. If the harvest is poor, they face hunger or worse. Renci has no realistic hope of improving his condition or that of his children. His sons will farm the same land. His daughters will marry other peasant farmers. The rigid social hierarchy ensures that the cycle will continue unbroken through generations. These three lives, Amenhotep the official, Nakht the craftsman, and Renci the farmer, existed simultaneously in ancient Egypt, each supporting the others in a social pyramid that channeled wealth and resources upward while distributing the hardship and labor downward. The magnificent civilization we admire today was possible only because the vast majority of Egyptians lived lives of unremitting toil with minimal reward, supporting the privileged existence of a tiny elite. The massive building projects that define ancient Egypt in our modern imagination, the pyramids, temples, palaces, and tombs, were not constructed through modern machinery or innovative engineering alone. They were built through the systematic exploitation of forced labor on a scale that is difficult to comprehend today. This system of corvée labor, where peasants were conscripted to work on state projects for months at a time, was one of the most brutal aspects of Egyptian life. Contrary to popular misconception, the great monuments of Egypt were not primarily built by slaves, though slaves certainly participated. Rather, they were constructed largely by ordinary Egyptian peasants who were temporarily conscripted during the annual Nile flood when agricultural work was impossible. This system, called bak in ancient Egyptian, required all common citizens to devote a portion of each year to state projects. In theory, this corvée labor was a form of taxation, a contribution to the state in the form of labor rather than goods. In practice, it was often indistinguishable from slavery. Peasants were rounded up from villages across Egypt, sometimes at spear point, and marched to distant work sites where they would remain for months under the supervision of armed overseers. At the very top stood the god king himself, the pharaoh, believed to be the living embodiment of the god Horus and the divine intermediary between the gods and mortals. Far from being merely a political ruler, the pharaoh was considered semi-divine, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance of the universe. When Egyptians bowed before their king, they weren't merely showing respect to a powerful man, they were prostrating themselves before a living god. The pharaoh's power was absolute and unquestioned. He owned all the land of Egypt in theory, controlled its resources, led its armies, and served as the chief priest of every temple. His word was law, and disobedience was not merely treason, but sacrilege. The pharaoh lived in unimaginable luxury, surrounded by courtiers, eager to fulfill his every whim. His palaces were architectural marvels, filled with the finest furniture, art, and textiles. His meals were prepared by dedicated chefs using the freshest ingredients. His body was tended by personal physicians and adorned with gold, precious stones, and the finest linen. Yet even this seemingly perfect existence had its dark side. Pharaohs lived under constant threat of assassination from ambitious relatives or officials. They were expected to maintain Egypt's prosperity through proper religious observances and military victories. Failure could lead to unrest or even rebellion, and they were never truly alone, constantly surrounded by servants, officials, and guards, a gilded cage of privilege and responsibility. Below the pharaoh stood the elite class, comprising perhaps 5% of the population. This group included high priests, viziers, chief ministers, nomarchs, regional governors, military commanders, and wealthy landowners. These individuals enjoyed tremendous privilege, living in spacious villas with gardens and pools, eating the finest foods, wearing elegant clothes, and commanding numerous servants. The elite were literate in a society where writing was a rare and valuable skill. They received formal education in specialized schools, learning not only reading and writing, but mathematics, astronomy, religious texts, and administrative techniques. This knowledge gave them near monopolistic control over government, religion, and record-keeping, the key institutions of power. Yet membership in the elite came with obligations. They served at the pharaoh's pleasure and could fall from favor suddenly and catastrophically. They were expected to fund building projects, supply troops for the army, and ensure that taxes were collected from their regions. Failure could result in demotion, confiscation of property, or even execution. The middle class of ancient Egypt was relatively small but important, consisting of skilled artisans, craftsmen, scribes of lower rank, merchants, and minor officials. These individuals possessed valuable skills or occupied necessary positions that afforded them a standard of living above the common peasantry, but well below the elite. A master craftsman who created jewelry for the royal court, for instance, might own a modest home and enjoy a diet that occasionally included meat and wine. A successful merchant trading luxury goods might accumulate enough wealth to live comfortably and even own a small plot of land. A mid-level scribe working in the temple administration might have enough income to afford a few luxuries and provide education for his sons. But this middle ground was precarious. Economic downturns, crop failures, or simply falling out of favor with a powerful patron could send a middle-class family tumbling back into the masses of peasantry. And while they enjoyed some comforts, they still lived under the absolute authority of the elite and ultimately the pharaoh. The vast majority of ancient Egyptians, perhaps 80% of the population, were peasant farmers who worked the land. Their lives were characterized by unrelenting physical labor, minimal comforts, and constant vulnerability to natural disasters and exploitation by their social superiors. The typical peasant family lived in a small mud brick house with dirt floors and few possessions. Their diet consisted primarily of bread, beer, onions, and occasional vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. They wore simple linen garments that they made themselves, often the same clothes for years until they literally fell apart. Their days followed the rhythm of the sun, beginning work at dawn and continuing until dusk. During the growing season, they planted, weeded, and harvested crops. During the flood season, when farming was impossible, they were conscripted for corvée labor on construction projects or maintenance of irrigation systems. Perhaps most oppressive was the tax burden they bore. Ancient Egyptian peasants typically surrendered between 20% and 50% of their harvest to the state. Tax assessors were notorious for their corruption, often demanding more than the official rate. Failure to pay could result in brutal corporal punishment or being sold into slavery to cover the debt. Peasants had essentially no legal rights as we would understand them today. They could not appeal to independent courts for justice. They could be conscripted for labor or military service at any time. Their daughters could be taken as servants or concubines for the elite. Their testimony carried little weight against that of their social superiors. At the very bottom of Egyptian society were the slaves. Some were prisoners of war, others criminals, and some were Egyptians who had fallen into debt slavery. Their lives were entirely at the mercy of their owners, who could beat them, separate them from their families, or work them literally to death with few consequences. Slaves performed the most dangerous and degrading work, mining in remote desert regions, quarrying massive stones, rowing in military galleys, or serving in households where they were vulnerable to every form of abuse. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation, with little recourse or protection. Some slaves, particularly those with specialized skills or those serving in wealthy households, might eventually earn their freedom, or at least achieve a relatively stable position. But for most, slavery was a life sentence of misery and exploitation, ended only by death or the rare act of manumission by a generous owner. The social hierarchy was reinforced through numerous visible markers. The elite wore finer clothes, often bleached to a brilliant white, that common people could not achieve. They adorned themselves with jewelry and cosmetics, wore wigs made from human hair, and carried symbols of their authority. They spoke differently, using a more formal register of the Egyptian language, and often incorporating foreign loanwords to demonstrate their sophistication. Even in death, the social hierarchy persisted. The elite were mummified and buried in elaborate tombs with grave goods to ensure their comfort in the afterlife. Middle-class Egyptians might afford simple mummification and modest tombs. Peasants were typically wrapped in reed mats and buried in simple pits in the desert, with few, if any, grave goods. Slaves might not receive proper burial at all, their bodies disposed of with minimal ceremony. Perhaps most insidious was how this rigid hierarchy was justified and normalized through religion and ideology. Egyptians were taught that the social order was divinely ordained, a reflection of the cosmic order established by the gods at creation. To challenge one's place was not merely to rebel against earthly authorities, but to disrupt Ma'at itself, an act of cosmic sacrilege. The concept of Ma'at, truth, justice, and cosmic balance, paradoxically served to reinforce inequality. Egyptians were taught that accepting their assigned place in the hierarchy, however humble, was virtuous and would be rewarded in the afterlife. Ambition beyond one's station was portrayed as greedy and disruptive. This ideological control was remarkably effective, despite the extreme inequality and exploitation that characterized ancient Egyptian society. Major rebellions were surprisingly rare. When they did occur, they typically happened during periods of central government weakness, such as the intermediate periods, when the pharaoh's authority had already been undermined by other factors. So, while we marvel at the magnificent achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization, the pyramids, temples, and artistic masterpieces, we should remember that these wonders were built upon the backs of a society where the vast majority lived lives of hardship, exploitation, and limited opportunity, trapped in a social system that offered them little hope of advancement or relief. To understand how this rigid social hierarchy functioned in practice, let us follow a day in the life of 3 Egyptians from different social strata during the New Kingdom period, around 1350 BCE. First, we meet Amenhotep, a high-ranking official who serves as the overseer of the royal granaries in Thebes. Amenhotep's day begins in his spacious villa on the east bank of the Nile. He is awakened before dawn by his personal servant, who helps him wash with scented water from a copper basin. Another servant brings his clothing for the day, a pristine white linen kilt of the finest quality, a broad collar of gold and semi-precious stones, and sandals made from woven palm fibers. One particularly dangerous profession was that of the scribe, who mixed pigments for painting tombs and temples. Many of these pigments contained toxic minerals like lead, mercury, and arsenic. Constant exposure led to chronic poisoning, causing tremors, cognitive impairment, and eventually death. Yet, ironically, scribes were considered fortunate compared to manual laborers, as their work was less physically demanding. Medical care for injuries and illnesses was primitive by modern standards. Though advanced for its time, Egyptian physicians combined practical treatments with magical incantations, seeing no contradiction between the two approaches. Some of their methods were surprisingly effective. Honey for wound dressing, willow bark containing salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, for pain relief, moldy bread containing natural antibiotics, applied to infected wounds, but many common treatments were ineffective or actively harmful. Open wounds were sometimes treated with animal dung, introducing dangerous bacteria. Toxic minerals like lead and copper were ingredients in many medicines. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits, was performed for headaches and seizures, often with fatal results. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, dating from around 1600 BC, reveals the limitations of Egyptian medical knowledge. While it contains rational treatments for bone fractures and surface wounds, it advises that deeper injuries to the chest or abdomen should not be treated, as they were considered inevitably fatal. For many serious conditions, physicians could offer only pain relief and comfort as the patient died. Even the wealthy and powerful were not immune to these dangers. The mummy of Rameses II shows evidence of severe dental abscesses that would have caused excruciating pain. Tutankhamun suffered from malaria and a congenital foot deformity. Queen Hatshepsut likely died from bone cancer that had metastasized throughout her body. Their wealth could buy them the best medical care available, but that care was still woefully inadequate by modern standards. In this environment of constant danger and limited medical options, it's little wonder that Egyptians turned to magic and religion for protection. Households were filled with protective amulets. Prayers and offerings to gods and goddesses were daily rituals. Magic spells were recited to ward off disease and injury. These practices reflected a people desperately trying to exert some control over a world filled with invisible threats and sudden death. Consider the experience of Nefertiti, a young mother living in a modest home in a village near modern-day Luxor during the New Kingdom period. At 24, she has already given birth to 4 children, though only 2 have survived past infancy. Her days revolve around caring for her family, preparing food, fetching water, and assisting her husband with his work as a potter. Nefertiti's home, like most in her village, is a simple structure of mud brick with a flat roof made of wooden beams covered with palm fronds and mud. The single main room serves as living space, sleeping area, and sometimes workspace. A small courtyard contains a clay oven for baking bread and a grinding stone for processing grain. The family's few possessions, reed mats for sleeping, some clay pots, a wooden chest for clothing, and a small shrine to household deities, are kept neatly arranged against the walls. Each morning before dawn, Nefertiti rises to rekindle the cooking fire. This daily task carries its own dangers. Sparks can ignite the dry reed mats or her linen clothing. Once, when her oldest child was an infant, a spark landed on his blanket while she was distracted. The blanket began to smolder, and only Nefertiti's quick action in smothering the ember prevented a potentially fatal fire. After preparing a simple breakfast of bread and beer for her husband, Nefertiti's next task is fetching water from the Nile. She places her large clay jar on her head and walks with other village women to the riverbank. The Nile provides life-giving water, but also harbors invisible dangers. Nefertiti has heard the priests explain that water demons can enter the body through the feet when wading in the river, causing the bloody urine and swollen abdomen that afflict many villagers. Symptoms we now recognize as schistosomiasis. She tries to minimize her time in the water, but complete avoidance is impossible given her daily needs. Returning home with her heavy water jar, Nefertiti begins preparing the day's main meal. The grain she uses must be carefully inspected for insects and mold. Once, during a particularly damp season, the family's stored grain developed a strange black fungus. They ate it anyway, having no alternative, and suffered days of painful stomach cramps and bloody diarrhea. Her youngest child, already weakened by a recent fever, did not survive this episode, as Nefertiti grinds the grain on her stone quern. The fine dust irritates her lungs, causing her to cough. Years of this daily task have given her a persistent cough that worsens during the dry season. The flour itself often contains tiny stone particles from the grinding process, which gradually wear down the family's teeth, leading to painful abscesses as bacteria enter through the damaged enamel. While preparing the dough for bread, Nefertiti keeps a watchful eye on her children playing in the courtyard. Her 3-year-old son has a habit of putting things in his mouth, and the ground is a minefield of hazards: sharp pottery shards, animal droppings, and potentially venomous creatures. Just last month, the child of a neighbor died after being stung by a scorpion that had hidden in a pile of clothing. For protection against such dangers, Nefertiti has placed a small statue of Bes, the dwarf god who protects households, near the entrance to their home. Around her son's neck hangs an amulet shaped like the Eye of Horus, believed to offer general protection. When she puts her children to bed each night, she recites a protective spell she learned from her mother. Back, O poison, come not forth. I am Horus. I have stepped on you. You shall not rise. Nefertiti's 5-year-old daughter helps with household tasks, learning the skills she will need as a future wife and mother. Today, the girl is helping to clean the sleeping mats by beating them with a stick to remove dust and insects. This releases clouds of dust containing mites, flea eggs, and dried rodent droppings, all potential sources of disease. The girl has recently developed a persistent cough similar to her mother's. As the hottest part of the day approaches, Nefertiti moves her food preparation to the shadiest part of the courtyard. The interior of their home becomes stifling in the midday heat. The mud brick walls, while providing good insulation, can reach temperatures that make them too hot to touch. Heat stroke is a common killer during summer months, particularly among the elderly and very young. While working in the courtyard, Nefertiti must remain vigilant against another danger: the neighbor's dog, which has shown signs of strange behavior recently, foaming at the mouth and acting aggressively, likely symptoms of rabies. Several villagers have already been bitten, and one is now seriously ill with fever and an intense fear of water. There is no treatment for this condition, which invariably ends in an agonizing death. As evening approaches, Nefertiti's husband returns from his workshop, bringing with him his own occupational hazards. His hands are cracked and bleeding from constant exposure to clay and water. His lungs are damaged from years of inhaling the fine dust from dried clay and the smoke from his kiln. He complains of pain in his back and knees from hours of sitting in a hunched position at his potter's wheel. The family's evening meal is eaten quickly before darkness falls. Oil for their simple clay lamp is expensive, so they try to complete most activities during daylight hours. The lamp itself is another fire hazard, easily knocked over by children or nocturnal animals that might enter the home before sleep. Nefertiti checks the corners of their home for scorpions and snakes, which often seek the relative coolness of human dwellings during hot weather. She shakes out the sleeping mats and carefully inspects the children's bedding. Despite these precautions, she knows that danger might still lurk unseen in the darkness as she lies down beside her husband and children on their reed mats. Nefertiti offers a final prayer to the household gods for protection through the night. She is exhausted from the day's labor, but also anxious about what tomorrow might bring. She is in the early stages of another pregnancy and knows all too well the dangers that lie ahead. The village midwife has already warned her that this birth might be difficult, as her previous delivery resulted in several days of bleeding that nearly claimed her life. This is the reality of daily existence for ordinary Egyptians, a constant negotiation with danger, a daily struggle against forces both visible and invisible that threaten life and health. Modern visitors to Egypt marvel at the magnificent temples and tombs, but few consider the precarious lives led by those who built and maintained this extraordinary civilization. The rigid social hierarchy of ancient Egypt was perhaps one of the most oppressive aspects of daily life for the majority of its inhabitants. Unlike our modern notions of social mobility, ancient Egyptians were born into their social class and, with rare exceptions, remained there for life. This stratified society resembled a steep pyramid, much like the monuments they built, with the pharaoh at the apex and the masses of peasants and slaves forming the broad base. The scale of these labor drafts was enormous. Herodotus claimed that 100,000 men worked on the Great Pyramid of Giza, rotating in 3-month shifts. While this figure may be exaggerated, modern archaeologists estimate that between 20,000 and 30,000 workers were indeed required, still a staggering number for an ancient society to organize and sustain. The conditions these laborers endured were brutal by any standard. They lived in hastily constructed workers' villages of mud brick hovels, sleeping on reed mats on dirt floors. Their diet, while better than they might receive at home, the state needed to keep them strong enough to work, consisted primarily of bread, beer, onions, and occasional fish. Hardly adequate nutrition for the physical demands placed upon them. The work itself was backbreaking and dangerous. Massive limestone blocks, weighing several tons each, had to be quarried, using copper chisels and wooden mallets, incredibly inefficient tools by modern standards. These blocks were then loaded onto wooden sleds and dragged by teams of men across the desert, up earthen ramps, and into position. Accidents were common and often fatal. Skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries show crushed bones, severe spinal injuries, and evidence of hernias, all consistent with moving massive stone blocks without mechanical assistance. Many skeletons show signs of arthritis and joint degeneration that developed at surprisingly young ages, testament to the physical toll of the work. The heat was another deadly factor. During summer months, temperatures in Upper Egypt regularly exceed 100-degree buys, 38 degrees Celsius. Working in direct sunlight, hauling massive stones, the laborers would have faced serious risk of heat stroke and dehydration. While water was provided, ancient graffiti mentions water carriers. It was likely insufficient given the extreme conditions. Dust was a constant hazard as well. Stone cutting and polishing released fine particles that workers inhaled continuously. Studies of mummified remains have revealed severe silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling stone dust, in many individuals associated with construction projects. This chronic condition would have caused progressive breathing difficulty, chest pain, and eventually death. Discipline at these work sites was harsh and unforgiving. Overseers carried whips and batons to motivate the reluctant. Ancient Egyptian art occasionally depicts these scenes, showing supervisors with raised sticks standing over laborers. Text from the Middle Kingdom period warns scribes that if they fail in their studies, they will end up with a stick on your side, for you are listening with your back. For those who attempted to flee the work sites, the consequences were severe. Papyri from various periods mention deserters being hunted down by special police forces. When caught, they faced brutal corporal punishment, extension of their service period, or even execution as an example to others. Some work sites, particularly remote quarries and mines, were surrounded by walls and guarded, not to keep outsiders away, but to keep the workers in. The psychological impact of forced labor was perhaps as devastating as the physical toll. Peasants were separated from their families for months at a time, with no guarantee they would ever return. They had no control over their daily lives, working from dawn until dusk under constant supervision. They were reduced to tools of the state, their individual humanity disregarded in service to the pharaoh's monumental ambitions. Some of the most brutal forced labor occurred not at the famous monuments, but at remote mining sites in the eastern desert and Sinai Peninsula. Here, criminals, prisoners of war, and the lowest classes of society were sent to extract copper, gold, and semi-precious stones under truly horrific conditions. These mines were located in barren, waterless regions where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees by 43 degrees. Water had to be transported from distant sources and was strictly rationed. Food supplies were minimal. Workers labored in narrow, poorly ventilated shafts where oxygen was limited and toxic dust filled the air. Cave-ins were common, burying miners alive. A particularly harrowing account comes from Agatharchides of Cnidus, who described gold mining operations in Egypt's eastern desert during the Ptolemaic period. The kings of Egypt condemned to the mines criminals prisoners of war, those convicted on false charges, and those who, because of their ruler's anger, have been thrown into prison. Not only the guilty themselves, but sometimes their relatives and friends as well are sent with them to ensure that those who inflict such punishments will have many workers and to increase the king's revenues. He continues with a description that could easily be mistaken for a modern account of a concentration camp. These unfortunate people, chained in irons, work continuously day and night, with no rest, carefully cut off from any means of escape. For barbarian soldiers who speak different languages from them stand guard, so that no one can, through conversation or friendly association, corrupt any of the guards. The mortality rate at these remote mining operations was staggering. Workers typically survived only a few months before succumbing to exhaustion, disease, accidents, or abuse. They were considered expendable, easily replaced by the next group of unfortunates condemned to the mines. Their bodies were often left unburied, denied the proper funerary rites that Egyptians considered essential for the afterlife. Even for those not subjected to corvée labor or mining, work in ancient Egypt was physically demanding and often dangerous. Farmers worked from dawn to dusk in the fields, using primitive wooden plows and harvesting grain with simple sickles. The stooped posture required for many agricultural tasks led to chronic back problems as evidenced by skeletal remains. Craftsmen faced their own occupational hazards. Metalworkers suffered burns and eye injuries. Potters inhaled clay dust that damaged their lungs. Stonemasons developed silicosis from stone dust. Textile workers hunched over looms for hours, developing skeletal deformities and eye strain. The physical toll of these occupations is visible in mummified remains, which frequently show arthritis, bone deformities, and evidence of repetitive stress injuries. Children were not exempt from labor. From as young as 5 or 6 years old, Egyptian children began contributing to family work. They helped in the fields, tended livestock, assisted in workshops, or performed domestic tasks. Child labor was not seen as exploitation, but as a necessary part of family survival and practical education. Nevertheless, skeletal remains of children often show signs of malnutrition and injuries consistent with heavy labor at young ages. The massive monuments that tourists admire today, the pyramids, temples, and tombs, stand as testaments not only to Egyptian engineering and artistic achievement, but also to a system of labor exploitation that caused immeasurable human suffering. Each stone block represents countless hours of back-breaking toil. Each elegant hieroglyph was carved by artisans who often developed crippling hand deformities from their work. When we marvel at the precision of the Great Pyramid or the beauty of Karnak Temple, we should remember the human cost of these achievements. They were built not through some mysterious lost technology, but through the systematic application of human muscle power on an industrial scale. Thousands upon thousands of individuals whose lives and bodies were sacrificed to create monuments that would outlast them by millennia. To understand the reality of forced labor in ancient Egypt, let us follow the experience of Paneb, a peasant farmer from a small village in Middle Egypt, who is conscripted to work on a temple expansion project during the reign of Rameses II in the 13th century BCE. Paneb's ordeal begins with the arrival of royal officials in his village during the early days of the Nile flood. The rising waters have made farming impossible, and traditionally, this would be a time for repairing tools, maintaining irrigation channels, and engaging in household crafts. Instead, the officials announced that all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 50 must report for corvée labor at the temple construction site in Abydos, some 30 miles away. For Paneb, a 35-year-old farmer with a wife and 4 children, this news is devastating. He has already served 2 previous labor drafts in his younger years and knows what lies ahead. His wife, Henut Mehid, weeps as he prepares to leave, knowing that the family's survival during his absence will be precarious. Their oldest son, at 14, is not yet subject to the draft, but must now assume his father's responsibilities in the household. Before departing, Paneb carefully divides their meager food stores, leaving the majority for his family. He takes only what he can carry in a small cloth bundle: a spare linen kilt, a wooden headrest, a small copper knife, and a clay amulet of the god Bes for protection. His wife presses into his hand a tiny scrap of linen containing a lock of their youngest child's hair, a talisman to ensure his return. The journey to Abydos is arduous. Paneb and the other conscripted villagers are formed into a column and marched under the supervision of armed guards. The summer heat is oppressive, and the men are given only minimal water rations. Those who fall behind are beaten with sticks until they rejoin the column or collapse entirely. By the time they reach Abydos, 2 elderly men from Paneb's village have died from heat exhaustion. At the construction site, Paneb is assigned to a work gang of 40 men under the supervision of a harsh overseer named Mena. Their first task is to build their own shelter, a long, low structure of mud brick with a reed roof that will house all 40 men for the duration of their service. The accommodations are squalid, with no privacy and minimal sanitation. The men sleep shoulder to shoulder on reed mats, plagued by lice, fleas, and the constant stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Paneb's work gang is assigned to the stone quarry, where they must cut massive blocks of limestone from the living rock. The tools provided are primitive, copper chisels that quickly dull against the hard stone and must be constantly resharpened, wooden mallets that splinter and break, and wooden wedges for splitting the rock. The work is not only physically demanding, but dangerous and technically challenging. Each day begins before dawn. The workers are awakened by the shouts of overseers and the sound of wooden clappers. They are given a breakfast of coarse bread and thin beer before being marched to the quarry as the sun rises. There they work continuously until midday, when they receive another small ration of bread and beer. Then work resumes until sunset. The quarry becomes an inferno as the day progresses. The white limestone reflects the sun's glare, making it difficult to see clearly and causing painful sunburn on exposed skin. The dust from stone cutting fills the air, coating the workers' bodies and infiltrating their lungs. Many men develop chronic coughs that produce black phlegm. Some begin to cough blood, a sign of advanced silicosis that is essentially a death sentence in this era. Accidents are frequent and often catastrophic. During Paneb's second week, he witnesses a partially cut block break free unexpectedly, crushing the legs of a worker named Hori. The man's screams echo through the quarry as he is carried away. He dies 3 days later from infection and blood loss, his body unceremoniously buried in a shallow grave outside the workers' compound. The pace of work is relentless. Each gang has a daily quota of stone to quarry, and failure to meet this quota results in punishment for the entire group. Mena, their overseer, is liberal with his whip, leaving bloody welts across the backs of those he deems lazy or careless. Paneb himself receives such a beating when he accidentally breaks a valuable copper chisel while trying to dislodge a stubborn piece of stone. After 3 weeks in the quarry, Paneb's hands are a mass of calluses and open sores. His back aches constantly from bending and lifting. His knees are scraped raw from kneeling on the stone. But he is one of the fortunate ones, still able to work and therefore to receive his daily rations. Those who become too injured or ill to work see their rations reduced, creating a desperate cycle where malnutrition further impedes recovery. The psychological toll is perhaps even greater than the physical. Paneb worries constantly about his family. Has the flood receded enough for his son to begin planting? Is there enough food? Has illness struck the household? With no means of communication, these questions torment him nightly as he tries to sleep amid the groans and coughs of his fellow workers. Escape is nearly impossible. The work site is surrounded by a wall patrolled by guards. The few who attempt to flee are invariably caught in the surrounding desert, unable to travel far without water in the scorching heat. The punishment for attempted escape is brutal. 50 lashes in front of the assembled workers, followed by being placed in wooden stocks for 3 days without food, exposed to the elements. After 2 months in the quarry, Paneb's gang is reassigned to transport duty. Now they must move the cut stones from the quarry to the temple site. Teams of 20 men are harnessed to wooden sleds laden with multi-ton blocks. They drag these massive burdens across the desert, their feet sinking into the sand, ropes cutting into their shoulders. Water carriers walk alongside, giving each man a precious sip at regular intervals to prevent collapse. Many do collapse nonetheless. One afternoon, as temperatures soar, a man named Userhat suddenly falls to the ground, his skin hot and dry to the touch, no longer sweating, classic symptoms of severe heat stroke. The overseers attempt to revive him with water, but he dies within hours, his body temperature too high for too long. His death is recorded simply as fallen in the work records, one of dozens of such casualties that month. By the 3rd month of his service, Paneb has lost significant weight. His ribs protrude, and his once strong arms have begun to take on a wasted appearance, despite the constant labor. The diet of bread and beer, occasionally supplemented with onions or dried fish, is insufficient for the caloric demands placed on the workers' bodies. Many develop night blindness, a symptom of vitamin A deficiency, making it dangerous to move around the camp after sunset. Disease spreads rapidly through the crowded workers' compound. A dysentery outbreak claims 5 lives in Paneb's barracks alone. Those afflicted soil themselves uncontrollably, becoming dehydrated as their bodies expel precious fluids. The sick are segregated in a corner of the barracks, given minimal care, and often left to recover or die on their own. As his 100-day service period nears its end, Paneb is one of only 28 survivors from his original gang of 40. Some have died, others have been crippled by accidents or illness and relegated to menial tasks around the camp. Paneb himself has developed a persistent cough and pain in his lower back that he knows will never fully heal. When finally released from service, Paneb begins the long walk home, his body broken, but his spirit sustained by the thought of reunion with his family. He carries with him his payment for 3 months of labor, a small sack of grain, barely enough to feed his family for a few weeks. The real compensation, he knows, is simply having survived to return home. As he crests the final hill and sees his village in the distance, Paneb reflects that he is one of the lucky ones. He has survived his corvée service and can return to his fields and family. But he also knows that the royal officials will return, perhaps next year or the year after, and he will once again be marched away to build monuments for the glory of a pharaoh he will never meet, constructing temples to gods who seem to have little concern for the suffering of those who raise their shrines. The experience of grief and mourning in ancient Egypt was intense, ritualized, and deeply embedded in their cultural practices. Death was an ever-present reality in a society where the average life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 35 years. Few families escaped the devastating loss of children, and adults frequently died in what we would consider the prime of life. The emotional impact of these losses was no less profound than what we experience today. But the expression of grief took forms that might seem alien to modern sensibilities. When death came to an Egyptian household, the initial response was immediate and visceral. Professional female mourners were often hired to lead the expressions of grief, but family members participated fully in the emotional display. Women would tear at their clothes, smear their faces with dirt and ash, beat their breasts, and wail loudly. Men might grow out their beards and hair as signs of mourning. These weren't merely performative actions, but culturally sanctioned expressions of genuine anguish. The Egyptologist Lynn Meskel notes that these dramatic displays of grief served important psychological and social functions. They provided a structured outlet for overwhelming emotions and signaled to the community that proper respect was being shown to the deceased. The intensity of the display often corresponded to the social status of the dead person, with more elaborate mourning for higher status individuals. The preparation of the body began immediately after death, as decomposition occurs rapidly in Egypt's hot climate. For those who could afford it, the body would be taken to the house of purification, where professional embalmers would begin the mummification process. For the poor, simpler preparations were made at home, often limited to washing the body and wrapping it in linen. The funeral procession itself was a public display of grief and status. The mummy would be placed on a sledge or in a coffin and transported to the tomb, accompanied by mourners, priests, and sometimes professional dancers and musicians. The journey could be short for common people or elaborate and lengthy for the elite. Tomb paintings show these processions in detail, with lines of mourners following the body and priests performing rituals along the way. At the tomb, final rites were performed before the body was sealed away. These included the crucial opening of the mouth ceremony, where a priest would symbolically open the mouth of the mummy or its coffin with a specialized tool, allowing the deceased to eat, drink, and speak in the afterlife. Offerings of food, drink, and other necessities were placed in the tomb, and prayers and spells from the Book of the Dead were recited. For most Egyptians, active mourning continued for 70 days, the same length of time required for mummification. During this period, family members might observe special dietary restrictions, abstain from celebrations, and wear distinctive mourning clothes. Regular visits to the tomb with offerings were expected, especially during festivals and significant anniversaries. But grief didn't end after 70 days. Egyptian culture encouraged an ongoing relationship with the dead through a practice known as the cult of the dead. Family members were expected to bring regular offerings to the tomb and to speak the name of the deceased, a practice they believed kept the person's memory and spirit alive. Many tombs included a false door through which the Ka, life force, of the deceased could emerge to receive offerings. Letters to the dead have been discovered, written on pottery bowls or papyrus and left at tombs. These poignant documents reveal the continuing emotional bonds between the living and the dead. Some ask for help or intervention from beyond, while others express continuing love and devotion. One particularly moving letter from a widower to his deceased wife reads in part, "What wrong have I done to you, that I should be in this bad situation I am in? What have I done to you? You have made my life a struggle. What did I do against you when I lived with you, that I must hide it? What have I done?" The psychological burden of grief was compounded by practical concerns. The death of a breadwinner could plunge a family into economic crisis. Widows were particularly vulnerable in a society where women had limited economic opportunities. While some could remarry or returned to their birth families. Others faced destitution. Orphaned children might be taken in by relatives, but could also end up in desperate circumstances. The emotional toll of frequent child mortality was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Egyptian life. Studies of skeletal remains from ancient Egyptian cemeteries reveal that approximately 50% of children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest mortality rates occurring before age 5. Parents would likely lose multiple children during their lifetime, each death bringing fresh grief. Evidence suggests that Egyptians did form strong emotional bonds with their children, despite the high mortality rates. Contrary to some theories that parents in high mortality societies avoided emotional attachment as a psychological defense, Egyptian art and texts reveal deep parental love. Children are depicted affectionately in family scenes, and advice texts emphasize the importance of honoring one as parents and the debt children owe for their care. The grief of losing a child is expressed in surviving texts. One Middle Kingdom stela, commemorating a young boy named E, reads, "O living ones upon earth, say 1,000 of bread and beer for the Osiris, the child E. I was one beloved of his father, praised of his mother, whom his siblings loved. I was a child who had not yet lived, when the West, death, claimed me." The psychological impact of living with such frequent loss is difficult to fully comprehend from our modern perspective. Egyptians developed cultural and religious frameworks to help make sense of death, but these didn't eliminate the pain of loss. Their elaborate preparations for the afterlife can be seen not just as religious obligation, but as expressions of love and hope, attempts to ensure that beloved family members would continue to exist and perhaps be reunited with the living in the field of reeds. For the Egyptians, death was not the end of existence, but a transition to another form of being. This belief may have provided some comfort, but the separation was still keenly felt. The tomb autobiography of Nefer-Seshem-Re from the Old Kingdom expresses this poignantly. "I have come from my town. I have descended from my nome, having done justice for its Lord, having satisfied him with what he loves. I spoke truly. I did right. I spoke fairly. I repeated what was favored. I seized the right moment so as to stand well with people. I judged between two so as to content them. I rescued the weak from one stronger than he, as much as was in my power. I gave bread to the hungry, clothes to the naked, landing to the boatless." These words, carved to last for eternity, reveal a person looking back on life with the hope that they lived well enough to be remembered kindly and to achieve a positive judgment in the afterlife. They reflect the universal human desire to have lived a life of meaning and to be remembered after death. The ancient Egyptians faced death with a frequency and immediacy that most modern people are spared. Their elaborate mortuary practices, their art filled with afterlife imagery, and their texts focused on proper preparation for death all reflect a culture that had to come to terms with mortality as a daily reality. Yet within this framework, they experienced the full range of human emotions: the devastation of losing a child, the loneliness of widowhood, the comfort of religious ritual, and the hope of reunion beyond death. Their grief was no less real for being expressed through cultural forms different from our own. When we examine the evidence they left behind, the tombs, the mummies, the texts, and the art, we see not just the trappings of an exotic ancient religion, but expressions of the same love loss and hope that humans have always felt in the face of death's inevitability. To understand the profound impact of grief in ancient Egyptian life, let us follow the experience of Satnefer, a middle-class woman living in Thebes during the 18th dynasty, as she faces the death of her 7-year-old son, Amenemhat. The boy's illness begins suddenly. A high fever, difficulty breathing, and a painful cough that produces blood-tinged sputum. Modern doctors might diagnose pneumonia or tuberculosis, but for Satnefer, the cause is clear: malevolent spirits, or perhaps the wrath of an offended deity. She immediately calls for both a physician and a priest, covering all possible avenues of treatment. The physician arrives first, a respected local healer named Pashed. He examines Amenemhat, feeling his pulse, checking the color of his eyes and tongue, and listening to his labored breathing. From his leather bag, Pashed produces various remedies: honey mixed with herbs to soothe the cough, a poultice of clay and plant matter for the chest, and a bitter-tasting concoction that the boy struggles to swallow. When the priest arrives, he performs rituals to drive away evil spirits, burning incense and reciting spells from a papyrus scroll. He places protective amulets around the boy's neck and wrists: a scarab beetle for renewal of life, an eye of Horus for healing, and a figure of Bes to ward off harmful entities. Satnefer watches these proceedings with desperate hope, willing to try anything that might save her son. Despite these interventions, Amenemhat's condition deteriorates rapidly. By nightfall, his breathing becomes increasingly labored, his small body burning with fever, despite being bathed repeatedly with cool water from the Nile. Satnefer sits beside him through the night, holding his hand, wiping his brow, and whispering prayers to Isis, who as a divine mother might understand her anguish. Satnefer's husband, Nebamun, a skilled artisan who paints tombs for wealthy Thebans, paces anxiously in the courtyard. Their 2 daughters, aged 10 and 3, have been sent to stay with Satnefer's sister, shielded from the crisis unfolding at home. As dawn approaches, Amenemhat's breathing becomes shallow and irregular. With a final, soft exhalation, the boy's suffering ends. The moment of death triggers an immediate outpouring of grief. Satnefer lets out a piercing wail that alerts neighbors to the tragedy. She tears at her hair and clothes, smearing dust on her face in the traditional expression of mourning. Nebamun, initially stunned into silence, soon joins her in loud lamentation. Neighbors and relatives begin to arrive, adding their voices to the chorus of grief. Professional mourners, women who specialize in leading funeral lamentations, are summoned and paid from the family's modest savings. These women, dressed in blue mourning garments, with their breasts exposed, lead the ritual expressions of grief, demonstrating the appropriate intensity and form that mourning should take. They sing dirges that speak of the tragedy of a life cut short and the cruelty of the gods in taking a beloved child. Meanwhile, practical arrangements must be made. Nebamun, despite his overwhelming grief, must negotiate with embalmers for the mummification of his son's body. As a middle-class artisan, he cannot afford the most elaborate process reserved for the elite, but he is determined to provide a proper burial that will ensure Amenemhat's passage to the afterlife. The family can afford a mid-level mummification. The embalmers will remove the internal organs, except the heart, dry the body with natron salt, and wrap it in linen, though without the expensive resins and elaborate amulets used for wealthier clients. The process will take 40 days rather than the full 70 days of royal mummification. While the embalmers do their work, Satnafer enters a formal period of mourning. She and the female relatives move to a separate mourning hut where they will remain for several days, wailing, singing dirges, and expressing their grief away from the main household. They abstain from washing, wear their hair loose and disheveled, and dress in special blue mourning garments. Nebamun, meanwhile, must continue working despite his grief. The family needs income more than ever to cover the funeral expenses. In the tomb he is currently decorating, he finds himself painting scenes of the afterlife, images of the field of reeds, where the blessed dead enjoy eternal happiness. The irony is not lost on him as he wonders whether his son will reach this paradise. When the mummification is complete, Amenemhat's body is returned to the family wrapped in linen bandages. The funeral procession forms at their home, with the small mummy carried on a wooden bier. The professional mourners lead the way, followed by a priest, then the bier carried by male relatives, and finally, the family and community members. The procession winds through the streets of Thebes toward the necropolis on the west bank of the Nile. The mourners' wails attract attention from passers-by, who pause respectfully as the funeral passes. Some join briefly in the procession, adding their voices to the lamentations, even if they didn't know the deceased. A cultural expression of solidarity and grief. At the modest tomb that Nebamun has prepared, a simple shaft with a small chamber at the bottom, the final rituals are performed. The priest conducts the crucial opening of the mouth ceremony, touching various parts of the mummy with specialized tools to symbolically restore the senses needed in the afterlife. Offerings of food, drink, and small possessions are placed in the tomb alongside the mummy. Satnafer places a small wooden toy boat in the tomb, Amenemhat's favorite possession. She also includes a lock of her own hair wrapped in linen, a personal connection between mother and child that she hopes will transcend death. As the tomb is sealed, she feels as though part of herself is being entombed with her son. The immediate funeral rites complete, the family returns home to continue the mourning period. For the next month, Satnafer wears her blue mourning clothes and observes various restrictions. She avoids celebrations and music, eats a limited diet, and spends time each day in ritual lamentation. Nebamun grows his beard as a sign of mourning, appearing unkempt and disheveled during this period. The psychological impact of Amenemhat's death extends far beyond these formal mourning practices. Satnafer finds herself instinctively calling her son's name before remembering he is gone. She wakes from dreams where he is still alive, only to face the renewed pain of loss each morning. She worries obsessively about her surviving children, checking on them repeatedly during the night to ensure they are still breathing. Nebamun copes differently, throwing himself into his work with an intensity that concerns his colleagues. In the privacy of their home, he sometimes breaks down in tears, but in public, he maintains the stoic demeanor expected of Egyptian men. At night, he drinks more beer than usual, seeking temporary escape from his grief. Their oldest daughter, old enough to understand death, becomes quiet and withdrawn. The youngest, too young to fully comprehend what has happened, repeatedly asks when her brother will return. Each question is a fresh wound for her parents, who struggle to explain death to a 3-year-old in terms she can understand. As the formal mourning period ends, the family establishes a pattern of regular visits to Amenemhat's tomb. On significant dates, the anniversary of his death, major religious festivals, and the beautiful Feast of the Valley, when families traditionally commune with their deceased relatives, they bring offerings of food, drink, and flowers. They speak his name aloud, believing this helps his spirit to live on. Satnefer also writes a letter to her dead son, inscribed on a clay bowl that she leaves at his tomb. In it, she expresses her continuing love and asks him to intercede with the gods to protect his siblings from similar fate. This practice of writing to the dead reflects the Egyptian belief that the deceased could still influence the world of the living, particularly in matters affecting their own family. Years later, when Satnefer herself dies, one of her final requests is to be buried near her son, hoping for reunion in the afterlife. The grief of losing Amenemhat never fully leaves her. It becomes integrated into her identity, a wound that scars over but never completely heals. This experience of profound loss and ritualized mourning was repeated countless times across Egypt's long history. The elaborate mortuary practices we associate with ancient Egypt were not merely abstract religious observances, but deeply personal responses to the universal human experience of grief, shaped by cultural beliefs and social expectations, but no less genuine for that. Religion permeated every aspect of daily life in ancient Egypt, extending far beyond the grand temples and elaborate funerary practices that dominate our modern understanding. For ordinary Egyptians, religion was not a separate domain of life, but an integral part of their everyday existence, influencing everything from mourning routines to agricultural practices, from childbirth to cooking. Unlike the official state religion, with its complex rituals performed by specialized priests in magnificent temples, household religion was intimate, practical, and focused on immediate concerns. The average Egyptian interacted with the divine realm daily through small household shrines dedicated to various deities and ancestors. These modest altars, found in archaeological excavations of ordinary homes, typically featured small statues or stelae representing gods, particularly associated with home protection and family welfare. Bes, a dwarf deity with leonine features, was especially popular in household worship. Despite his somewhat fearsome appearance, Bes was considered a friendly, protective force who guarded against evil spirits, venomous creatures, and nightmares. His image appears on numerous household items, from furniture to cosmetic containers. Pregnant women and new mothers, particularly, sought Bes's protection during the dangerous times of childbirth and infancy. Taweret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright with lion paws and crocodile back, was another household favorite. She protected women during pregnancy and childbirth, critical moments when both mother and child hovered between life and death. Small figurines of Taweret have been found tucked into the corners of bedrooms and birthing areas. The household gods required daily attention. Family members, usually women, would present small offerings of food, drink, and flowers to these deities each morning. They would recite simple prayers, asking for protection, health, and prosperity. These weren't the elaborate rituals of temple worship, but intimate conversations with divine powers believed to take a personal interest in the family's welfare. Amulets played a crucial role in personal religious practice. Egyptians of all social classes wore protective charms made from various materials depending on what they could afford: faience, stone, metal, or even simple mud for the poorest. These amulets took many forms: the Eye of Horus for general protection, the scarab beetle for rebirth and regeneration, the Ankh for life, the Jed pillar for stability. Children often wore multiple amulets to protect them from the numerous dangers they faced. Magic and religion were inseparable in ancient Egyptian thought. Spells were recited for everything from curing illness to keeping scorpions away from the house. The line between prayer and magical incantation was blurry at best. A mother treating her child's fever might simultaneously apply a medicinal poultice, recite a spell invoking Isis, who had protected her divine son Horus, and place a protective amulet around the child's neck. Seeing no contradiction between these approaches, water played a significant role in daily religious practice. Before prayer or entering sacred spaces, Egyptians would purify themselves with water. Priests underwent multiple daily purification rituals, but even ordinary people observed simpler versions of these practices. Small basins for ritual washing have been found in many homes. The Nile itself was considered sacred, its annual flood a divine miracle that renewed the land. Food preparation and consumption had religious dimensions as well. Certain foods were avoided during particular times or by specific groups. Priests, for instance, abstained from fish, which was considered impure in some contexts. Before meals, small portions might be set aside as offerings to household deities or ancestors. During festivals, special foods associated with particular gods would be prepared and consumed. The agricultural cycle was thoroughly integrated with religious observance. Planting, irrigation, and harvest were accompanied by rituals honoring appropriate deities. Farmers might pour a libation to Osiris, god of vegetation and rebirth, before sowing seeds. The first fruits of harvest were often dedicated to the gods before the family consumed any portion. These practices reflected the precarious nature of farming in the Nile Valley, where divine favor was seen as essential for survival. Dreams were considered direct communications from the divine realm. Egyptians kept dream books to interpret these nighttime messages, and important dreams might prompt specific religious actions. A troubling dream could indicate the need for additional offerings to a neglected deity or ancestor. A positive dream might be seen as divine approval of a planned undertaking. For the average Egyptian, the official temples were largely inaccessible spaces. Ordinary people were permitted only in the outer courtyards during special festivals, while the inner sanctuaries where the god's statue resided were restricted to purified priests. Instead, people would pray at the temple gates or leave small votive offerings in accessible areas. Some temples had special hearing ears, carved ears on exterior walls, where people could whisper prayers, believing the god inside would hear them. During major festivals, however, the barriers between ordinary people and the divine temporarily dissolved. The god's statue would be brought out from the temple darkness in elaborate procession, carried on a bark, ceremonial boat, through the streets. These rare glimpses of the deity were moments of intense religious experience for common Egyptians, who would crowd the processional routes, hoping for divine blessings or healing. The festival of Obet in Thebes was particularly magnificent. The divine statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu would journey from Karnak to Luxor Temple amid music, dancing, and abundant food and drink. For ordinary Egyptians, these festivals provided rare moments of leisure and abundance in otherwise difficult lives. They were opportunities to petition the gods directly, to celebrate communally, and to momentarily transcend the rigid social hierarchy. The beautiful Feast of the Valley was another significant religious event that touched ordinary lives. During this festival, the statue of Amun would cross the Nile to visit the mortuary temples and tombs on the West Bank. Families would gather at the tombs of their ancestors, bringing food and drink for a communal meal that symbolically included the deceased. Musicians would play, mourners would weep anew, and the boundaries between the living and dead would temporarily blur. Religious festivals served important social functions beyond their spiritual significance. They reinforced community bonds, redistributed resources through temple offerings that were later shared, and provided psychological release from the hardships of daily life. For a few days, the strict social hierarchy might relax slightly, with even the poorest Egyptians receiving portions of temple offerings and experiencing rare moments of abundance. The religious calendar structured the Egyptian year rather than our modern weekend. Egyptians observed numerous festival days throughout the year when normal work was suspended. These weren't evenly distributed, but clustered around significant religious events. During major festivals, even corvée laborers might receive time off and special rations of food and beer. Personal piety increased during the New Kingdom period, c. 1550, 1070 BCE, with evidence of more direct relationships between individuals and deities. Votive stelae from this period show ordinary people praying directly to gods, often thanking them for healing or other personal interventions. One famous example from Deir el-Medina reads, "I shall make praise to Merit Seger, for she heard my voice when I called to her. She came to me at the voice of my prayer. She came to me with sweet breezes. She showed mercy to me after she made me see her hand. She returned to me, appeased. She made my malady forgotten." This text reveals a deeply personal relationship with the divine, showing that religion wasn't merely about appeasing distant, fearsome powers, but could provide genuine comfort and hope in difficult circumstances. For many Egyptians, their religious practices were sources of psychological resilience in a world filled with hardship and uncertainty. Yet religion could also be a source of anxiety. The gods were not always benevolent and could send punishment for ritual impurity or moral transgressions. Texts mention the terror of God striking wrongdoers. Illness and misfortune were often interpreted as divine punishment, leading to intense self-examination and penitential practices. Stelae have been found where individuals confess their wrongdoings and beg divine forgiveness. Religion also reinforced the social order. The pharaoh's divine status justified his absolute power. The concept of ma'at, cosmic order and justice, included accepting one's place in the social hierarchy. Priests, who were often from elite families, controlled access to divine favor. Religious texts emphasized obedience to superiors as a moral virtue pleasing to the gods. For all its complexity and occasional oppressiveness, religion provided ancient Egyptians with a coherent framework for understanding their world and their place in it. It offered explanations for natural phenomena, guidelines for moral behavior, comfort in times of suffering, and hope for continued existence beyond death. In a world where human life was precarious and often brutally short, these were no small consolations. To understand how religion permeated daily life, let us follow Meritaten, a young woman living in a modest household in the city of Akhenaten, modern Tel El Amarna, during the reign of Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE. This was a time of religious upheaval, as Akhenaten had elevated the sun disk Aten to supreme deity status, diminishing the traditional pantheon. Yet, despite these official changes, many ordinary Egyptians continued their traditional religious practices alongside the new state cult. Meritaten's day begins before dawn. As the first light appears on the horizon, she rises from her sleeping mat and performs her morning purification, washing her face and hands with water from a clay basin while reciting a brief prayer to the rising sun. Hail to you, Aten, Lord of the two horizons, who illuminates the land with your rays. This prayer reflects the official religion promoted by Pharaoh Akhenaten, but Meritaten's religious practice is more complex and syncretic than royal ideology might prefer. After washing, Meritaten's next act is to approach the small household shrine built into a niche in the main room of her family's modest mud brick home. Here stand small figurines of traditional protective deities, Bes with his fearsome leonine face, Taweret with her hippopotamus body, and a simple stela depicting the goddess Hathor. Despite the pharaoh's religious reforms, these household gods remain important to ordinary families like Meritaten's. She refreshes the offerings before the shrine. A small cup of water, a piece of bread from yesterday's baking, and a few wildflowers she gathered the previous evening. As she places these items, she whispers prayers asking for protection for her family, health for her pregnant sister, and success for her husband's pottery business. These are not the grand theological concerns of temple priests, but the immediate, practical needs of daily life. Around her neck, Meritaten wears multiple protective amulets, an Eye of Horus for general protection, a scarab beetle for good fortune, and a small figure of Taweret to ensure safe childbirth when her time comes. She also wears a simple string bracelet that has been blessed by a local wise woman with protective spells. Each item provides a layer of supernatural defense against the many dangers of Egyptian life. As she prepares breakfast for her family, Meritaten is careful to set aside a small portion of bread and beer as an offering to the household gods and ancestral spirits. Before the family eats, her father recites a brief prayer of thanks to the Aten, but also mentions Osiris, the traditional god of vegetation who ensures the grain grows. This syncretism, blending official state religion with traditional practices, is common among ordinary Egyptians, who hedge their spiritual bets by honoring multiple divine powers. When Meritaten's younger brother complains of a stomachache, her mother responds with a three-pronged approach, typical of Egyptian healing practices. She gives him a medicinal tea made from herbs, known to settle the stomach, places a protective amulet of the god Thoth around his neck, and recites a healing spell that invokes Isis, who healed her son Horus from scorpion stings. For the ancient Egyptian, there is no contradiction between what we would call medicine, magic, and religion. All are integrated approaches to maintaining well-being. Later in the morning, Meritadin accompanies her pregnant sister to visit a local shrine dedicated to Hathor, goddess of fertility and childbirth. They bring a small votive offering, a clay figurine of a woman holding a child that Meritadin's husband crafted in his pottery workshop. They place this in a designated area outside the shrine, where ordinary people can leave offerings without entering the sacred inner spaces reserved for priests. At the shrine, they join other women in prayers for safe delivery. A temple attendant, not a high priest, but a lower-ranking religious functionary who mediates between common people and the divine realm, accepts their offering and promises to include the pregnant woman's name in the daily rituals. For a small additional payment of grain, he provides them with water that has been used in the temple rituals, now considered blessed and imbued with healing properties. On their way home, they pass a small procession carrying a portable shrine containing an image of the local manifestation of Amun-Ra. Despite the pharaoh's attempts to diminish traditional gods in favor of the Aten, local religious practices continue. Meritadin and her sister join other passers-by in bowing respectfully as the procession passes, some reaching out to touch the shrine for blessing. The religious functionaries carrying the shrine pause occasionally to allow particularly desperate supplicants to approach with prayers for healing or fertility. In the afternoon, Meritadin helps her mother prepare for the upcoming festival of the Aten, a celebration instituted by Akhenaten. They bake special sweet cakes and prepare garlands of flowers to decorate their home. While they work, her mother teaches her traditional religious songs that have been adapted with lyrics praising the Aten instead of Amun or other traditional deities. Another example of how ordinary Egyptians blended old and new religious elements. As evening approaches, Meritadin's father returns from his work as a minor scribe in the royal administration. Before entering the house, he stops at a small basin of water by the doorway to ritually purify himself, washing away not just physical dirt, but spiritual impurities that might have attached to him during the day. This simple act reflects the Egyptian concern with ritual purity as a prerequisite for divine interaction. The family's evening meal is preceded by another offering to the household shrine and a prayer that thanks both the Aten and traditional deities for the day's sustenance. After eating, as darkness falls, Meritadin's grandfather tells stories of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, traditional religious myths that explain the cycle of death and rebirth, the flooding of the Nile, and the daily journey of the sun. Despite official religious policy, these stories remain central to how ordinary Egyptians understand their world. Before sleeping, Meritadin performs one final religious act. She places a small protective figurine of Bes at the foot of her sleeping mat to ward off nightmares and evil spirits that might attack during the vulnerable time of sleep. She recites a brief protective spell. O Bes, guardian of sleep, watch over me in the darkness and keep harmful spirits far from my ka. As she drifts off to sleep, Meritadin's last thoughts are of the upcoming festival, when she will join the entire community in celebrating the divine forces that govern their lives. For her, as for most ancient Egyptians, religion is not a separate domain of life or a matter of abstract belief, but an integrated system of practices that provides protection explanation, comfort, and hope in a world filled with danger and uncertainty.